across the UK. On DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
And yes, good afternoon. Welcome to the home of Common Sense. It's another week, and boy, do we start off in fine form in terms of fodder to chat, debate and talk to the United Kingdom about this afternoon. There's so much on the agenda. Prime Minister Keir Starmer, of course, facing accusations of a Brexit betrayal over a new EU trade deal that will see Britain send money to Brussels, accept European judges' authority and allow French boats to access UK fishing waters for 12 years. Man alive. Have we been stuffed by Starmer? 0344 499 1000. Also this afternoon, Gary Lineker confirming he's leaving the BBC and will present his final match of the day on Sunday, following a backlash over that social media post featuring a rat, an image, of course, linked to anti-Semitic propaganda. I mean, at that point, it was really a no-brainer. It's whether the BBC were going to be bold enough to act, and they have. And former US President Joe Biden has been diagnosed with aggressive prostate cancer that has now spread to his bones. The 82-year-old is now reviewing treatment options. The current president, Mr. Trump, has sent his well wishes to the former president. Details on the way. Everything you need to know, all the breaking news right here on Talk 0344 499 1000. The Sausage Summit continues. As we speak, they're down there at Lancaster House. Antonio Costa, the president of the European Council, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of everything European, and Keir Starmer. A unlikely trio telling us how fantastic this cross-border deal is going to be. Keir Starmer has given European fishermen access to British waters for 12 years in order to land the deal. I mean, 12 years. Where else do you sign a 12-year contract on something so intrinsically important to a nation? And whilst there will be people who come at this from either, a Remainer aspect or a Brexiteer aspect, let's come at this from a fisher person's aspect. You have to say fisher person now because obviously it's too gender specific to say fisherman. We jest. If you're a fisherman and this is your trade, your livelihood, how do you feel about this? Because everything I'm reading this morning is from fishing authorities and bodies and official spokespeople saying this is an absolute killer for the fishing industry. So Keir's given European fishermen access to British waters for 12 years to land the deal. British and European negotiators have reached a fish for food deal, granting EU fishermen rights until 2038 in return for a veterinary agreement to boost trade. So the EU get all our fish, send 7 million kids to the UK and can veto any bidding we have on a defence contract. And in return, we get to export sausages unhindered. Yeah. I really not making that up. We will be able to export some meats like sausages without any hassle. A banger of a deal, it's being described. This Fisher thing, Britain agreeing to align with EU plant and animal health laws and be subjected to European Court of Justice decisions over them. A deal on defence pact has also been struck, and there is agreement to continue negotiations on the youth mobility deal at a later date. I'm not so bothered about that, oddly. Of all the things, the youth mobility thing, if you're under 29 and you can go for a walkabout with your rucksack and get a gig in Costa or Le Costa, depending on which way you're doing it. Yeah, I mean, I get the problems with it, but of all things. Jonathan Reynolds, the business secretary, gave this deal a solid 8 out of 10. Now, that's quite telling, actually. The business secretary can't quite give it full marks. A solid 8 out of 10. Do you know the interesting thing about this? I was reading a piece Suella Braverman writing in The Telegraph made a very simple but powerful point, and she was talking about 2016. We remember the date, 16th of June 2016. That's how it's 9 years ago coming up when the vote came in to tell us what had happened. Now, in the piece, she was there in her Fareham constituency office with her Leave campaign team. And, of course, at the time, you remember, all the mood music in those early hours was that it had been lost. and in fact it was a vote to remain. I think Farage gave an early interview to the press saying it looks as if we haven't got this. And Suella Braverman writes this, and this is the bit that sort of the hardline evangelical Remainers cannot get their skinny heads around. They just simply can't fathom this bit, OK? She says, we stood for something more enduring than polls or punditry, for sovereignty, for the conviction that a people, any people, deserved to govern themselves. Yes, we were the underdogs, but we fought for the notion that borders matter, that culture counts, that laws passed in London carry greater legitimacy than diktats from Strasbourg. We made the case for Britain and braced ourselves for noble defeat. She says, and then came Sunderland. And you will remember back in 2016 what happened in Sunderland. There was a Leave vote of 61%. Disbelief, she says, then a second, then a third. Could it be the industrial north, battered and patronised for decades, has defied every expert, every threat, and roared with unambiguous pride? Leave. And the key part of what she writes there, this is the bit I could not get my head around, why there is such a furore. People who voted for sovereignty, people who believed that laws passed in this country carried a greater legitimacy than laws or diktats passed elsewhere, Brussels, Strasbourg, etc. That is not that controversial. It's quite easy to work that out. You don't have to. You know, if you call up a radio show and a very clever presenter starts, trying to bamboozle you with gotcha questions and give us the benefit of Brexit, etc. Well, the benefit is self-governance. That is kind of it. That is sort of, it only has to be that. It's a completely legitimate position to take when asking where we are best served. And anyone, even if of course we want to trade with the EU. The whole original deal back in the 70s was a trading bloc, a common market, of course, where you could exchange goods, and there was certain understandings on that trade agreement. But you'd have to be, genuinely stupid to not see that the expansion of the EU is not just a trading project. It really isn't about just finding parity on certain goods and produce. It's absolutely not that. The growth and the curious expansion of the EU has its tentacles in all sorts of other areas, from policing to military, education. Now, we know that's not an invented right-wing position. That's just a fact. And if you are a massive Uber fanboy of the EU, you're probably OK with that. But there's nothing wrong with not being OK with that and seeing the expansion go way beyond anything that you thought was reasonable for the bloc. Obviously, if you're going to have a trading bloc, some laws and rules have to be harmonised. Everyone understands that bit. But when you start to get into territory where rules and regulations go way beyond trading, you start to go, well, hang on a sec, it doesn't really feel like a trading thing. And why has a trading bloc got a president? Why has it got an anthem? Why has it got a currency? They're sort of the hallmarks of a country, right? Well, why does that have to go with that? That in itself is worth a 5,000-word dissertation. And so Braverman's point there, I think, is bang on. So when 8 years down the line, you see some of what you voted for unequivocally sort of trickle back, you have every right to have the hump. You have every right to say, hang on a sec, this doesn't pass the sniff test. Of course you're going to have a deal. Of course you will have, we'll give you this, you give us that. We've just done a trade deal, partially done a trade deal with the United States. There's going to be some of that, right? Everyone understands that. But the only headlines, which right now, sitting here on a national radio station, I should be able to wheel out at least a top 3 of big box office deals that you would look at and go, wow, Starmer, you've played an absolute blinder there, mate. Look what you've got for us. Now, I've looked at this, I've been following it. If you're watching us visually, you will see on our screen that the summit, or the response of the summit, is still going on. So you have those 3 characters, Antonio Costa, Ursula von der Leyen in the middle, Keir Starmer. This is a central London event. they are saying Britain is back on the world stage, essentially. With what qualification, I don't know, and I cannot fathom what it is that we've got out of this. The biggest headline is that we've allowed EU fishermen to fish in our waters for the next 12 years. Not the next 12 months, not the next 36 months. You could go, OK, these things work in maybe blocks of 3 years, and then we can look at it again. 12 years. 12 years, just shy of a decade and a half, for God's sake. Let's get a word on this and the other big stories of the day. Emma Trimble is back with us, writer, broadcaster and presenter. Emma, good afternoon to you.
Good to be back, Ian.
Nice to have you on again. Lots to say, of course, on this. I mean, Keir Starmer is the leader that keeps on giving. He says Britain is back on the world stage after this landmark deal, I'm quoting, obviously, with the EU. Let's just remind ourselves, of course, for those at the back who are not keeping up with things, let's just remind ourselves of how this whole thing began.
The total number of votes cast in favour of leave was 17,410,742. This means that the UK has voted to leave the European Union.
So that's what it was all about, Emma. And since then, we've had ferrets in the sack fighting like Billio. And, we eventually got used to the idea that we were going to start, renegotiating around the world. And, we think of Australia, we think of America, India, etc. Things are starting to move. And then suddenly Starmer comes along and says, we're just going to give away some fishing rights. Right.
Yeah.
To what degree? 12 years? Man alive, what's going on?
We've been absolutely shafted, Ian. It's amazing to think that it was 10 years ago now, because it was actually the Vote Leave campaign that originally politicised me, if you can believe that. So, as you said there, when you were talking about Suella Braverman's remarks, this is about sovereignty. And what we've got here with this so-called landmark deal is actually that, and as is always the case with the European Union, if you want to make a deal with them, you have to give up some of your sovereignty in return. Except now we don't have any control at all over the sorts of rules that they would force us to follow. I mean, this would include us being subject still to the ECJ when it comes to food regulations. And now, obviously, there are lots of people who support Keir Starmer and the Labour Party who are trying to make him out to be some kind of great statesman, just pointing to the so-called trade deal with Donald Trump, which was just a slight reduction in those tariffs. The reality is that trade deal with the United States was just the beginning of a potential proper trade deal. And if we cozy up to the EU in this way, we are immediately scuppering our chances of being able to do a proper deal with the United States. And we are yet again shackling ourselves to a declining power, which is the European Union. And I don't mean that in the sense of European countries are declining powers. What I mean by that is that the argument that people made around the time of Brexit still stands, which is that the European project is not sustainable for those countries to be held together in common currency and slowly draining them of their lifeblood by centralising their sovereignty. That is not what is in the best interests of Britain. It's not what is in the best interests of any European country. And so the idea that you would sell out your sovereignty, that you would sell out the fishermen, that you would, on the one hand, talk about limiting migration, and on the other, reintroducing an element of freedom of movement. The idea that you would do that also that you can sell some sausages and stand in the queue for a shorter amount of time and passport control. In my experience going to Europe, countries in the European Union since Brexit, the queues are actually shorter for the non-electronic gates because there are less of us.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. I mean, I genuinely thought when this happened today, Emma, I mean, I should really have been able to come to this studio today and at least name one big thing and go, wow, OK, the fishing thing's a bit rubbish and that doesn't sound good, but look what he's got us in return. There isn't one. There really isn't one.
No, it's the trinkets. And people made this, I think it might have even been Kate Hoey, if I remember rightly, but it was almost a decade ago now, made the point that those things that the Remainers wanted from the European Union were trinkets. They were things like being able to go interrailing, not having to use, go through passport control and see an actual human being rather than using the electronic gates in return for something as serious as sovereignty. And I get this all the time. People will say to me, well, Brexit has been a failure. Surely Brexit has been a failure. And on the one hand, Brexit hasn't been completely done. I think most people would accept that. The European Court of Human Rights is an ongoing problem. I don't think we can really achieve what we intended without leaving the European Court of Human Rights. But at the same time, as you said yourself, Ian, this was about sovereignty. And the problem with sovereignty, of course, and it's not really a downside in the grand scheme of things, is that you are free to screw up yourself. And given that we had a political class that didn't want Brexit in the first place, it's hardly surprising that they've continued to scupper it and have continued to betray the British public when many people like Keir Starmer wanted to rejoin the European Union. So I think it's hardly a surprise that we haven't used our sovereignty to the benefit of the British public when we have an elite that is so fundamentally out of touch. And if Labour want to try and talk tough on things like immigration to try and stave off the inevitable tsunami that's going to come for them as it came for the Conservatives, because people are being driven to reform, this is not the way to do it.
Yeah, and the sneering of those that were not just supporters of Remain. And look, it's a democracy. It's fantastic. You can vote that way or that way. That's the way it works. And, may the best man win, blah, blah, blah. 52-48, yeah, it was close, but that's also how these things work. But the sneering of it from the kind of left-wing meerkats who pop their head up every 5 minutes telling us, that you would have to be some kind of supercharged fool to have even considered voting for it. I honestly believe it. The more I hear these people, still bitter 8-9 years later, I think what it's dismantled is that the whole European feel that they got for it, a nice warm feeling in the pit of their belly that rule Britannia, blighty, which they hated all of that. They loathed that kind of idea, the sort of standalone, standout man of global trade and history and all that goes with it. They hated it. So when we were diluted a little bit in the EU, and I think that suited the left just fine. It satisfied them that our heady status of years gone by was no longer quite as prominent as it was because we were part of a group now. And I think that's what's riled them more than anything.
Yeah, the foundation of the European Union is fear, and not fear of external powers, but fear of their own people. The idea that many people made, the argument many people made during the Brexit referendum was that we need the European, common economic area. We need the European Union to bind us together so that we don't go to war with each other. It's a hangover from the First and Second World Wars. And so it is in a very fundamental and inherent way saturated with a fear of the electorate. The people who are defending this are not Democrats. They are people who hold the voting public in complete disdain and don't trust them. And whenever the public do something that they don't want them to do, they call it populism, and they try to brand them as racist, brand them as these sort of thick troglodytes who don't know any better and who need to be lectured to by the Eurocrat international liberal elite, who are, as David Goodhart has put it, nowhere people. Even the European Union's currency, people may not have noticed, but if you look on a euro note, there are little images, art of bridges and bits of architecture and so on. None of those things are real. None of those are real places. Even on the currency, it is the ultimate sort of utopian nowhere place. And that is what these people stand for. They don't represent the interests of our fishermen. And like the Labour Party, they don't represent the interests of our farmers. They are fundamentally oriented towards global interests that have very little to do with what people in this country actually vote for, which is why we constantly get more immigration despite the fact that we're always voting for less.
Emma, stay with us. Lots more still to come. Emma Trimble, great words from Emma so far. More on that story from you as well. 0344 499 1000. Have we been stuffed by Starmer? We'll talk Gary Lineker. I'm sure he's delighted with this EU deal. The Joe Biden story, sad news out there today. And the huge Brit star set to become James Bond. But have you heard of him? Details on the way. This is Talk.
I very much doubt that Keir Starmer will be changed. I wanted a challenge to be made to Gordon Brown at the end of the last Labour government, and there appears to be no appetite ever within the Labour Party to change leaders. We're almost the exact opposite of the Conservatives, who change their leader at the drop of a hat. So I don't think that's going to happen. What I'm going to focus on is helping the government to make better decisions.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Gareth in Exeter says, so the 8th of May is known as VE Day. Does that make the 19th of May the European Victory Day, when Starmer gave it all away? What a terrible betrayal we're all witnessing, says Gareth in Exeter. We've got Emma Trimble with us, the writer, broadcaster and presenter. We're looking at the big stories of the day, including this one, of course, Emma. Gary Lineker has finally gone. He's been at the BBC for 137 years. That's how long he's been doing Match of the Day. But he's announced he's leaving the BBC and not presenting the 2026 World Cup either. Let's have a listen.
I've stood up for minorities and humanitarian issues and against all forms of racism all of my life, including, of course, anti-Semitism, which I absolutely abhor. There's no place for it and never should be. So I think it's best for all concerned that I step down from BBC presenting duties altogether and not do next season's FA Cup or World Cup. The final day of the Premier League season on Sunday will be my last show.
What a shame. He says there's no place for anti-Semitism. Well, there clearly is, Emma, on his Twitter feed.
Yeah, this is coming in the wake of him having tweeted out an anti-Zionist, anti-Israel tweet. He's been very vocal about that. In the tweet that he retweeted, I think it was, there was an emoji, I think, of a rat, which obviously has anti-Semitic connotations. He apologized, said he didn't necessarily realize that that rat emoji was in there, and now he's resigning. And obviously Gary Lineker has been relentlessly political, so people will be very pleased, I think, to see him go. I think people are sick of hearing his opinions on everything other than football, but he has a very successful podcast company. He's probably going to go off to focus on that. But he's the perfect example of somebody who thinks that making all of these statements aren't political, that he's just a good person. He's the ultimate halo polisher, if you were.
100%. He abhors it all. He stood up for mine. Isn't it funny when people of that persuasion feel the need to tell you, how virtuous they are? I've always stood up for, I hate bullying. I don't know anybody who likes bullying. Who likes bullying? Who wakes up in the morning and goes, can't get out of bed unless there's a bit of bullying going on. So we all hate it. We all hate oppression. We all hate unfairness. Nobody has a monopoly on that.
Yeah, it's the culture of hectoring that people have been sick of for a really long time. And in a way, Gary Lineker's almost a kind of anachronism in this, because he's continued with this longer than it's been fashionable. The peak, I think, was probably about 2 years ago, at the very height of Black Lives Matter and that kind of thing. And people were really sick of the hectoring, particularly in football, things like taking the knee. The implication was, of course, to lecture the audiences, to lecture the crowds, to not be racist, telling them, almost in a kind of paternalistic way, that they should be good and saintly, like Saint Gary Lineker. And I think people are well and truly sick of that. So actually a rare example of good judgment on Gary Lineker's part to decide to step down.
Yeah, Gary's done the right thing for once. There you go. This story, sad news that Joe Biden has been diagnosed with an aggressive form of prostate cancer. What's interesting here, there was a clip back in 2022, not 1922, although I think Biden was around then, in 2022, where they couldn't work out, was it a blunder, what he said then, or was it a genuine reveal? Let's have a listen to what he said 3 years ago.
And because it was a 4-lane highway that was accessible, my mother drove us, and rather than us be able to walk. And guess what? The first frost, you know what was happening? You had to put on your windshield wipers to get literally the oil slick off the window. That's why I and so damn many other people I grew up have cancer. And why can't, for the longest time, Delaware had the highest cancer rate in the nation.
Now, he said that 3 years ago, and of course what we take from that is that, has this been a longer battle than something that is just recent? And the relevance of that, of course, would explain maybe what happened of him dropping out the presidential race, among other things. It is nonetheless fairly interesting that he quite clearly stated he had cancer.
Yeah, who really knows, because Biden has said so many things that he clearly didn't intend to say, didn't necessarily make any sense. However, many people have been talking about this online today, is that there is something a bit peculiar, and this is not to, spread some kind of conspiracy theory, but there is something a bit peculiar about the fact that this is an advanced prostate cancer, so stage 4 prostate cancer. And when prostate cancer is one of the easiest cancers to detect early, so it's a bit peculiar that in somebody as important as the president and of the age that he is, that this would be picked up once it was already at a late stage. Yeah. So I think many people are taking that to imply that perhaps this has been an ongoing problem. Perhaps this bears some relation to his strange behavior towards the end of his presidency in particular. But who really knows? And there's no way of knowing aside from doing something which nobody has the right to do, which is demand the former president's medical.
Absolutely. Let's finish on a lighter story. We'll have to be brief on this one, but the race to become the new James Bond heats up within the world of British actors. A huge star seems to be the new frontrunner, but will he or any manage to live up to someone as great as this?
I admire your courage, Miss...
Trench. Sylvia Trench. I admire your luck, Mr...
Bond. James Bond.
It doesn't get more iconic, if you like, than that. Moments just like that. The actor that has been, certainly appears to be the bookie's favourite is Theo James. I know, Emma, that, this is your specialised subject. If you were doing Mastermind, it would be James Bond. You can name them all. You can name all the baddies. You know where they were filmed, who sang the original music. It's a big one for you, this, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a trap. When you said we had to be brief, I was thinking, well, it won't be too difficult for me to be brief. As you well know, I have never seen a Bond film, although I have to, and I actually don't know who Theo James is either.
Well, I did think it's weird that all the headlines say a huge star. I'd say, he's an emerging star, I would.
Had you heard of him, Ian?
Only because of White Lotus.
Which I also haven't seen, but
no, I haven't seen it either. But
I will say that it's pretty impossible for anybody to live up to Sean Connery.
Yeah, there you go. I think on that point, it's a perfectly reasonable point to finish on. Emma, thank you as ever for your time. Emma Trimble, the writer and broadcaster with us on the programme. Over to you. We're talking about the EU deal. Oh, wow, what a deal, Keir. It's amazing. Have we been stuffed by Starmer? 0344 499 1000. Our lines are open. In a couple of moments, we'll cross over to Lancaster House. Our reporter there is Theo Usherwood with the latest. Anu's Anita Rees-Mogg is going to be with us, and James Ball, political editor at the New European, thrashing this one out on this deal. What sort of deal is it, and what do you make of it? Lines are open. This is Talk.
across the UK. On DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
It is indeed Talk. We are discussing, of course, the Prime Minister claiming a new reset deal with the EU will make food cheaper, expand market access and boost the UK economy by nearly £9 billion by 2040. He says the agreement includes reduced checks on British food and drink exports, enabling easier trade of products like sausages, while the EU boats will maintain access to UK fishing waters for 12 years without increasing their catch. In return, the EU has also pledged to ease border checks and allow British tourists to use e-gates. Here's Keir Starmer speaking today at the first EU-UK summit in London since Brexit.
Today we have struck this landmark deal with the EU, a new partnership between an independent Britain and our allies in Europe. This is the first UK-EU summit. It marks a new era in our relationship. And this deal is a win-win. It delivers what the British public voted for last year. It gives us unprecedented access to the EU market, the best of any country outside of the EU or EFTA, all while sticking to the red lines in our manifesto about not rejoining the single market, the customs union, and no return to freedom of movement.
Well, in just a moment, we'll speak to Annunziata Rees-Mogg, Head of Communications at Popular Conservatism and a former MEP, of course, and James Bull, Political Editor at the New European. Just before that, let's get the latest on what has been happening over there at Lancaster House. Our reporter is Theo Usherwood with an update on this. A bit of a powwow working through the night, Theo, and then, of course, the dynamic trio made it onto the stage to explain all the good bits, and apparently there's no negatives, according to Mr. Starmer. Afternoon, Theo.
A very good afternoon to you, Ian. Yes, it's worth just trotting through exactly what's been agreed and then what has not been agreed. So as you mentioned, that £9 billion a year by 2040 boost to our food and agriculture trade. The number 10 press release, indeed, Mr. Keir Starmer himself absolutely adamant that it's going to help our food producers, particularly those who are making burgers and sausages, which can now be exported to the European Union as part of this agreement. But in return, of course, there is quite a heavy price to pay. The EU has been given full access to our territorial fishing waters for the next 12 years. Worth bearing in mind that we'd initially hoped, that is the British government, that we'd only be able to give them access for 4 years. So they've managed to get it up to 12. And then it's worth just covering what hasn't exactly been agreed. As Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, said in her speech at the press conference here at Lancaster House, there is a second step to the defence agreement, which would, of course, guarantee British firms in this country access to that €150 billion defence fund. That hasn't been settled as part of this agreement. There's just a commitment that there is going to be further talks on that. The Youth Mobility Scheme, or Youth Experience Scheme, if you want to give it its proper moniker. We don't have a cap yet to be announced on exactly how many young people and exactly the age bracket of young people that will be able to come to this country from the European Union, whether they'll be able to bring dependents with them. We assume so, or indeed the length of the visas. Is this going to be an agreement similar to what the Australians and New Zealanders have, where they can come to this country for 3-4 years, or is it actually going to be much shorter? And then a commitment for British tourists to be able to use e-gates. However, there is a caveat with that, Ian, that the European Union have introduced as part of that agreement, and European countries are going to be able to refuse the right of British tourists to access those, or British passport holders, the right to access those e-gates if they so wish.
So it's not straightforward, but we can transport an unimpeded sausage. And I think we just lost Theo's line at that point.
No,
listen,
I'm still here, Ian, if you can hear me.
I was just making the point that, you know, that our biggest tick on the list there seems to be unimpeded burgers and sausages?
Unimpeded
burgers and sausages.
Steve Bray is outside playing. Yes, that seemed, and of course that's hugely important to manufacturers of burgers and sausages at the present, or until this agreement. They have to be subject to quite strict controls, Ian, from the European Union to ensure that they comply with all of the necessary checks. And Keir Starmer and the government has pointed out that it's led to a 21% hit on exports to the European Union. We're not going to get all of that back, but the hope is, as part of that agreement, we'll be able to get some of it back. Keir Starmer, describing this agreement as a win-win, said he was closing the deal in the national interest and that Britain was back on the global stage. Von der Leyen, in a historic moment, excellent result. We're turning the page and bringing in a new chapter. But it does feel here, at least in Lancaster House, that the European Union is much happier than the British government about this agreement. They're the ones who are really in the ascendancy, and that Keir Starmer wanted to get this deal done by today as part of his Brexit reset. But in doing so, in creating that short time frame for an agreement, that's meant that actually working through the night, he's had to acquiesce, and his negotiating team has had to acquiesce to EU demands.
Theo, thank you. The music you can hear in the background, as Theo did allude to there, I think is that man called Steve Bray, who's the lunatic with the megaphone, often seen on Cottage Green and other sort of similar areas like today. Let's get a word on this from James Ball, political editor at the New European, and Annunziata Rees-Mogg, head of communications for Popular Conservatism and former MEP. Good afternoon to you both. Annunziata, firstly, there it is. We're back on the world stage. The words of Keir Starmer.
The EU is a dying economic bloc of protectionist countries, and if that's the world stage, I think we would be better advised to explore countries that actually have growth, ambition and strong futures.
When you look at, I mean, I was genuinely waiting today for Mr. Starmer to at least wheel out a kind of a big announcement, you know, whatever people think about the fish deal, whatever is yet to be decided on defence and freedom of movement for younger people, etc., that there would be a kind of a totemic moment that he could wave that paper and say, well, yeah, OK, the fish, it's a 12-year thing, but hey, look what we've got, kids. There doesn't seem to be one of those moments.
So far, it feels very much like a one-way street, that the British are conceding and the EU is taking. That on the list of wishes that both sides would likely have had, whether it's on fisheries or free movement or allowing certification of products, it looks like the EU is getting its way, and in return on immigration and so forth, Britain is not getting anything that we've heard yet. And I allow some leeway for there may be more to come. But so far, this has been a one-way street to the EU, as it always has been. But after all, Keir Starmer always wanted us back in the EU, so why wouldn't he do this, hand over our sovereignty back to the bloc?
James Ball, political editor at the New European. I mean, you've heard what's been announced so far. There is, a little bit more to come over the, coming weeks and months, or probably years, knowing the way these things tend to work. But at the moment, based on what you've seen, even as a man that, you like the idea of the EU and a Remainer and all that goes with it, I think it's fair to say this does look very much like a deal that favours the European Union.
I'm not sure I agree with that, really. There's quite a lot that we need that we lost when we made the decision to vote to leave. And part of this was, if we want to export, the checks on the borders were absolutely killing our farmers, but they were killing our fishers. If you talk to people in the fishing industry, the fact that these checks were there meant we export most of what we catch. We weren't even being able to sell that. There's quite a lot in this where we needed to fix it. And I sort of feel like Annunziata and I should be swapping sides. So she should be welcoming this as perhaps the first sincere effort to make Brexit work or to minimise its damage. and to settle things in the long term that we've had. I should be railing against it because it will make re-entry less likely. It has done as much as it can to actually make it possible for us to trade with the 27 countries with which we border. And selling goods, selling fresh food, selling meat, selling fish, that's got to be to countries near you. And this makes that work.
Okay.
So it's unflashy, but it helps us.
All right, Annunziata, how do you respond to that? You should be pleased with this deal, says James.
In return for being allowed to sell to them, and actually under international law, we should have mutual recognition of standards anyway for our food industry, as New Zealand does, and as they have an obligation to give us. So Labour government love going to the international court and kowtowing to their will when it comes to the Chagos Islands. Why are we not fighting our corner on this and having the mutual recognition of our standards, which are clearly just as high? But what it does mean is that our farmers can only produce food to EU standards, but without the very EU-specific subsidies that the CAP provides to European farmers, that it has to provide because their regulations make them so uncompetitive. And if we look at things such as GM crops that can be pest resistant, and we're already growing since Brexit in this country, the EU doesn't allow them. So our farmers are going to have to follow rules but not have any of the benefits. Our politicians are going to have to follow rules and not have any say. This is a terrible deal.
James, we're rule takers all the way through this one.
Well, we were never going to be able to have the right to force France to take produce that doesn't meet their standards. We have demanded the exact same in the US trade deal. Quite rightly, we have said British consumers don't want hormone-fed beef or chlorinated chicken. So we said to America, we will buy your beef if it meets our standards. It is completely reasonable for the EU to say the same.
It's ridiculous. And we need to be trading with the rest of the world, and this will limit our ability to make those trade deals. And because it's going on simultaneously to the American one and the Indian one, it could very likely have a big impact on how successful those outcomes are, but also the ones we've already signed, the enormous deal with TTIP.
James?
Well, we've managed to agree these deals, though. This is everything that people said they wanted from Brexit, and every single time there's been arms. We have a US deal, we have an India deal, we have TTIP, and they are all compatible. They have been checked, they do work, and they are compatible with the standards that we want. This idea of throwing out food standards or farming standards was wildly unpopular with the public. Most people in the country like the bits of this deal. They like the travel. They like youth mobility, only for youth mobility for short times, polls brilliantly. They want this to be done, and they want to stop relitigating a referendum from 9 years ago.
It might sound great until you realise that Spain has 17% youth unemployment, and that in fact it will be a large number of people coming here to take jobs young British people could get. When it comes to the university, the suggestion that they will cut the fees, well, our universities are arguing that they're only surviving by being topped up by the higher fees charged to foreign students. So what, do our universities go under and British students can't get an education at all? Now, I think there are really serious problems with how much Keir Starmer is handing over and not thinking about how it impacts the British public. And immigration is undoubtedly the biggest issue in this country at the moment. And adding more people, whether they're young and European or not, is not going to make the British people happy. Just this week, there seem to be admissions from Labour that they don't want to give votes to 16-year-olds, and it's thought because so many are voting Reform, and indeed, I think Reform's largest proportion of vote share is with the 18 to 25-year-old cohort, and yet they're going to push these measures that they will hate. They're losing support of the British public just when they need it most.
Just a final point, James. There is and I don't know whether we will ever get any confirmation of this, but there is a belief out there that had the Tories won the last election, this deal would have looked remarkably similar. Do you share that?
I sadly think it probably would have, because it was about the only deal that would ever be done, and it's the only deal that would ever be possible, and we needed it. We need normal trade relations. And the thing is, it's very easy for Brexiteers to relentlessly say they would have done it better, they would have done it better. They had years and years to do so, and they never bloody managed it. So the deal had to be made, it's made, and it took a Remainer to do it, which is ridiculous.
And same question, Annunziata, taking family members out of this, but the last government, Rishi Sunak, I'm sure you weren't the biggest fan of his, but, you know, he'd always alluded to the mobility scheme for younger people, freedom of movement, etc. Do you think the deal that Mr Sunak might have carved would have had, you know, a fairly similar structure to this one?
I don't think Rishi Sunak was a true believer in Brexit, and I don't think he was understanding what the British people expected and wanted from it. I think it is extremely important that both Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage, their respective parties, have said that any sovereignty that is handed back, any bits of Brexit that are undone, they will undo should either of them win the next election. And I think the EU and Keir Starmer would be well advised to listen to that.
Well, I mean, it's certainly not going to be quiet on this front over the next couple of years. We'll watch with interest, and we will speak again. Thank you to you both. Annunziata Rees-Mogg, Head of Communications for Popular Conservatism, and, of course, she is former MEP as well. And James Ball, Political Editor at the New European. You heard it there. I am intrigued by, I think, Sunak's deal would have probably been exactly this. I mean, bearing in mind that the machinery of the civil service is where all the kind of legwork is done on this kind of stuff, I think it would have looked, you know, more or less that. Badenoch can say, well, it's not the deal I would have struck, so we're not happy. You know, we're not giving this 8 out of 10, as Jonathan Reynolds has. Mr Farage, similarly, not happy. Have you been stuffed by Starmer? Do you sense on this one? 0344 499 1000. I think the most kind of obvious way to articulate where I see the problem is that there is no headline here. There's no big headline that translates to them. I'm sure within the figures or somewhere, if you crunch the numbers, somebody will say, no, but look, we're going to make this amount of money by this year and then more after that, etc. No big the biggest headline is that we've given away fishing rights for 12 years to the EU. The biggest headline should have been something where Keir Starmer says something we can all digest and go, well, I don't like the man, but fair play to Mr Starmer. We can't do that because there isn't one there. 0344 499 1000.
I don't think the Prime Minister believes in lower immigration at all, but because it's politically expedient for him, he's
just brought forward an awful lot of policies that say that he does want immigration to be lowered. You may question his belief, but we can't question his actions, can we?
Well, yeah, we can, because actually we offered him options during the immigration bill to go much further, to bring in a hard legal cap on the number of work visas that would be given out each year, and he turned it down.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
This one from Andy, who says the main point of Brexit, in my eyes, was to make the government accountable to the British electorate. So every 5 years we can keep or replace them as we see fit, unlike the EU. So the 12-year deal for fishing, in my opinion, was done as the EU can see where the next election vote away from the EU supporting parties. By removing a key symbolic political trophy, they are banking on reform getting in for a term and then being replaced by the time this is up for renewal again. This is now the time for the Conservatives of the Reform to seriously start planning to remove this government at the next election, says Andy in Cornwall. Let's go to Shirley in the Cotswolds. Thank you, Andy, for that. Shirley, how are you doing?
Hello, Ian. I'm fine, thank you.
Good. What are you making of all of this?
Well, I've been listening to the station most of the morning, and a lot of people like me, staunch Brexiteer, we're all... a lot of people have been ringing in saying that they won't make it in the next election. Labour will be gone and Reform are going to get in. I have a different take on it. I think that Keir Starmer, who I am seething about what he's done, I think he's played a blinder here, unfortunately. I think he's going to make it very, very difficult for Reform now, because Reform have been saying, Richard Tice said if they get in, they'll just rip it all up. But they can't, because there's going to be a lot of people on the left of politics and Brexiteers, the Remainers, who will be celebrating today. So that's a large chunk of the voting community. And I don't think that they will just be able to walk in and tear it up. So I think that Starmer might have got himself back into number 10 for another 5 years.
That's a very good point, isn't it? That if there's a deal, there's a deal, and a contract is a contract. You can't, with the best will in the world, you wouldn't be able to undo it, no matter who got in the next election, right?
No. So, unfortunately, I'm not very happy at all about what's happened. I think Starmer knows he's being well advised on this one, and I think that it's put the Reform Party in a very sticky situation.
Yeah, spot on. Shirley, thank you very much indeed for that cracking point. You would have a Reform... assuming Reform won the next election, you'd have a Reform government who could do nothing about a 12-year deal, or by then it would be 8 years left on it, whatever it happens to be. Crazy times, right? Stephen says, I'm happy that we've made this EU deal. Perhaps we can get back some of the 35 billion quid a year GDP hit that we took with Brexit. Also, I can't take seriously anyone with a surname Rees-Mogg. Sorry. She speaks very well of you, Stephen. That's all. That's all I can say. One from Mick in Walsall. He says, why would you allow young people to bring dependents to Britain if they are only taking bar work or studying? We all know these people will never return to their own country, especially if they are immigrants being given EU citizenship, says Mick. Yeah, I mean, I thought that when it was said earlier. I think it was Theo that mentioned it. Why would you bring dependent? You don't go backpacking with your nan, do you? You tend not to, and you might do. I don't know. How did that go for you? Ian is down in London. We've not got long, Ian, but I'm sure you can do it. Good afternoon.
I'll tell you something. I want to know, it really is, I spoke to you last week and I said about Waldorf and Statler, the Muppet.
Yes.
It seems to be, It is. It's getting even more so. Like, it's the Muppet Show, where in all of the publicity, in all of their manifestos, did they say they're going to give the fishing rights for 12 years, and we're going to do this, and we're going to let everybody in?
Well, they would say they hadn't negotiated at that point.
Yeah, but anybody would say, but you knew it was going to be that way. They already had it in their mind.
They had 4 years in their mind, apparently. And then they negotiated into the early hours and came out with 12 years. So God knows who was negotiating for them.
Well, I'll tell you something. If you went to get a bank loan, can you imagine? Like, I only want to borrow 10 grand. Oh, why don't you have 20 million instead?
Spot on. Spot on. Listen, Ian, great call. Thank you very much for that. One comes in here from Elsa, who says, I live in the EU for my sins. I've never seen a British sausage in Italian supermarkets and can only buy cheddar cheese occasionally in the German Aldi supermarket. I look forward to filling my trolley with British bangers after Starmer's brilliant deal with the EU. Welcome back to the EU SSR. Don't say you weren't warned. News at 2 is next.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Good afternoon, welcome back. The home of common sense. Not a lot of common sense going over there at Lancaster House today. The Prime Minister insisting a reset deal with the EU will make food cheaper, open up its market and add nearly £9 billion to the UK economy by 2040. That's a while away. Most importantly, he says it puts Britain back on the world stage. But does it? Where was the money shot for the UK on this one? And has Starmer royally stuffed us? We'll take more calls on that. Also this afternoon, polling shows that people feel like strangers in Britain, but not just because of migration, as Keir Starmer suggested. Other factors like the cost of living, the pandemic and working from home also driving a growing sense of isolation. Funny that, isn't it? Some of us could have predicted that a couple of years back. We'll have full details. And James Corden, best known for Gavin and Stacey and The Late Late Show, has hinted at running for London Mayor, with Labour set to need a new candidate as Sadiq Khan is expected to stand down at the end of his term in 2028. Could you really imagine James Corden standing up there as the Mayor of London? pontificating about ULEZ cameras and congestion charges. Oh dear. More on that as well. Everything you need to know, all the breaking news right here on Talk 0344 499 1000. This one comes from Woody, who says, so the 8th, I think I read this one, I'm going to read it again for this reason. Gareth in Exeter, sorry. The 8th of May is known as VE Day. Does that make the 19th of May European Victory Day, when Starmer gave it all away? What a betrayal we are all witnessing, he says. And Celia makes this point: oh my God, traitor Starmer's opening comments. Britain is back on the world stage. Probably can't spell democracy, let alone respect it. Why are our negotiators so pathetic? India rubbish deal. No other country would sign it. How much do we have to pay towards the defence fund so we can submit a quote to win a contract against EU subsidised companies? There's the problem. Having worked for 4 European companies since 1975, I clearly understand their methods better than our negotiators. Shafted again, says Celia. Thank you for that. Let's get a word on this and the other big stories of the day. Alan Tolhurst is, of course, chief reporter at Politics Home. Alan, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
Nice to have you back with us. Let's remind ourselves then, Britain is back on the world stage. Don't take my word for it. Alan, these are the words of Keir Starmer. Here he is speaking just an hour or so ago at that landmark deal at Lancaster House.
Today we have struck this landmark deal with the EU, a new partnership between an independent Britain and our allies in Europe. This is the first UK-EU summit. It marks a new era in our relationship. And this deal is a win-win. It delivers what the British public voted for last year. It gives us unprecedented access to the EU market, the best of any country outside of the EU or EFTA, all while sticking to the red lines in our manifesto about not rejoining the single market, the customs union, and no return to freedom of movement.
Alan, if somebody said to you, I don't know, in a pub quiz, you know, what was the biggest bonus for Britain on the 19th of May when Starmer and Ursula had a powwow down there in London, what would be the answer?
I think it would probably have to be, certainly the one that would affect most people, would be the ability to go back to using the EU passport gates at airports. That is probably the one that's going to have the most kind of impact on people, certainly as we get head into the summer. It's not exactly a huge return on investment on this supposedly massive deal, is it? But that's probably the one that's going to have the most impact. Although we currently still, if you look at the details of the document so far, we don't actually know when that's going to come into place. It might not even come into place by this summer when it would have the most impact.
It does seem that the biggest headline out of all of this is the fishing story, where apparently our negotiators kicked off with a 4-year suggestion. You can have rights to our waters for 4 years. They negotiated through the night. I don't know if that was a sort of EU technique, get the old Brits nice and sleepy and they won't really care. But they ended up going from 4 years to 12 years. I mean, I'd love to have been a fly on the wall on that particular meet.
Yeah, and that's actually the sort of top estimate that anyone really had seen ahead of the agreement coming through. The government has kind of countered that and saying that actually the principle of having the EU involvement in British waters was not something that was kind of negotiated this time round. That goes back to the previous agreement done under the last government, and this simply was about kind of coming up with a more longer term agreement so that we don't have to go back into this kind of heated negotiation year after year. But obviously if you're on the other side of it, it does look as though effectively this agreement, which you didn't like in principle, has now been set in stone for the next 12 years. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of kind of anger over there, or anguish over there. Obviously fish has always been this kind of really totemic point about Brexit. It doesn't contribute a huge amount to the UK's GDP, or it's not a huge part of our economy, but it has become pretty totemic as to when we talk about the control around our kind of our laws and our borders and kind of how we rule things. It does seem as though the fishing has been a massive part of it, and it does feel as though this time round the Keir Starmer government really kind of been willing to accept kind of more of the EU side of things in order to try and win round the Brussels on other aspects.
Yeah, I guess, you know, I've often wondered whether it's as simple as, you know, the fact that we are an island and surrounded by water. There's something, powerfully symbolic about a circle of EU fishermen around the place who can come so far in and just nick all the cod and then leg it back to Finland or France or wherever the heck they came from, and do so unimpeded with a big fat green light from the British government. There's something, I suppose, that it suggests, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I think it is. Like I say, it doesn't. It's not a huge part of the economy, but it is kind of to our nationhood and the way we kind of look after our own sovereignty. And I think that's always been part of it. And I think that whenever you try and argue from the other side and say, oh, well, it's not a huge part, it's almost something that we're willing to accept kind of these kind of rules in order to get bigger wins on much larger sectors. That's always what kind of annoys the people who voted to leave the EU in the first place, because it wasn't about making those kind of trade-offs. It was about being able to set those rules ourselves without having to kind of make agreements with Brussels.
Yeah, and I suppose there is something, it's all about the optics often and perception over reality in politics, as you well know, Alan. And it will be added to a list, won't it? He stuffed the pensioners, stuffed the farmers, stuffed the fishermen. That's how it will be sold come election day in 2029. That's the kind of thing people will be saying about Labour.
Well, I think for this government, one of the reasons they were so hard to pursue this was because they wanted to have these three deals: the deal with America, the deal with India over the line, and now the deal with the European Union. This 19th of May was always kind of in the diary as being this big issue. And having spoken to people, they were always they knew that whatever kind of agreement they came up with, the people on the right, the Reform and the Tories were always going to say this was a surrender deal. I think Kemi Badenoch is about to have a press conference in the next hour about the surrender summit the Conservatives are calling it. I think it would have always been that, regardless of what they got out of it. And so in a sense, I think this government was kind of willing to kind of accept some things in order to try and get the wins, knowing that there was always going to be this backlash, and that actually it's about kind of getting those things on, things like alignment, the kind of frictionless business stuff, and they were kind of willing to accept those kind of brickbats. I think you're right, it maybe plays into kind of a wider narrative, but I think by 2029 they think the economy will be in such a place they'll be able to sell kind of a different story rather than this kind of current narrative.
And as one of our callers mentioned just before the news, if the polls are to be believed, and Reform UK, despite only having 5 MPs, could actually form the next government, let's assume hypothetically they do form the next government, they will be left with a 12-year or 8 years, whatever it is, fishing deal that they can do absolutely nothing about.
Yeah, and in fact, Ursula von der Leyen was asked about that at the press conference, saying, well, the Conservatives have vowed, if they got back into power, to undo everything that's been agreed to. What would happen, And I think Ursula von der Leyen knows that would be very difficult to do so. If this thing does get set in stone, that'd be very difficult to unpick it, regardless of what people would want to do. So yeah, you're right. It does kind of tie the hands. It does kind of set the wheels in motion that it's very hard to reverse down the line.
Meanwhile, let's move to this story, Alan. Angela Rayner facing calls to introduce legal protections for right-wing staff under Labour's Employment Rights Bill. This is Lord Young, Toby Young, for the uninitiated. His amendment seeks equal protection for all political beliefs, banning punishment for expressing legal or controversial views at work. He, of course, also heads up the Free Speech Union, highlights a case of Reform UK activists losing jobs due to right-wing opinions, and he's suggesting there's a two-tier protection system running here.
Yeah, Lord Young has a real bee in his bonnet about this particular bill, because he's already laying an amendment which he thinks there's going to be some sort of banter ban in pubs and football stadiums and that kind of stuff. And so he's already kind of pushing hard against it. And yeah, now he's pushing against it in terms of these beliefs. I think it comes down to the fact that what is protected in law is basically like sort of philosophical beliefs rather than kind of strongly held opinions. And he's got this feeling that I think that essentially there are people who on the left who have what is classed in law as a philosophical belief, and that on the right, if you're kind of a conservative, a small c conservative, that's just your sort of opinion about things, and therefore that isn't protected in quite the same way. So it would be quite interesting to see I don't think the amendment's particularly going to go very far, but it would be interesting to see as we go further if there are more of these kind of cases and whether it does highlight the kind of the way that this law as it currently stands is applied. But I think, yeah, it's just kind of a little bit more mischief making for Toby Young, and as you say, a bit of publicity for the Free Speech Union on this.
Indeed. And this one as well. Sadiq Khan will probably stepped down in 2028, it would mean he'd been there for, what, three terms, isn't it? I think I'm right in saying. Yeah, is that right, Alan? 3?
Yeah, he was first. Yeah, he was first elected in 2016. So yeah, he won his 3rd term in last year's election.
And he got an extra year due to lockdown, of course, in between all of that. Well, apparently there's a new kid on the block who's going to take up the cudgels. James Corden, the actor, him of Gavin Stacey fame, also, of course, known for presenting the Late Late Show in the United States. Has hinted at his ambitions to run for Mayor of London. I can't think of anything more preposterous than James, you know, if you like him as an actor, that's fine, but sometimes you can't really cross that line very easily, although, of course, Schwarzenegger did it with Governor of California, so maybe there is hope for James.
Yeah, it's really quite a fun story, this, and it reminds me of, so back in the Blair era, when they were kind of on the devolution agenda, one of the reasons they looked at the regional assemblies and they looked at kind of directly elected mayors, one of the reasons they pulled back on it was because there was kind of a fear that it would basically become a popularity contest and that areas would just vote for kind of local celebrities. I remember speaking to someone talking about how they were worried that if there was a mayor of like Cardiff, that like Shirley Bassey or Tom Jones would end up being the mayor of Cardiff, and in the end they kind of pulled back from it. But actually, when those mayors were introduced later on, and we saw those metro mayors, you know, people like Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham up in the northwest, Andy Street in the Midlands, it looked as though the public wasn't kind of that way inclined. That actually they didn't want to vote for celebrities; they wanted to vote for kind of serious politicians. So I think James Corden might struggle, and I'm not sure, even in this kind of culture of celebrity, whether someone thinks that, you know, if they like the character Smithy from Gavin and Stacey, they want that person running what essentially is, you know, it's a huge business being the mayor of London. You know, the country is, you know, the city is 10 million people. It has a huge budget. It actually is, the powers of the mayor of London have actually grown quite a lot in the 25 years since it's been in force. And so yeah, it's a massive job. And you know, as the kind of as a politician, you've got the most kind of the biggest direct mandate of any politician in the UK, more so than the Prime Minister, because you're actually directly elected as that mayor. So yeah, I think the idea that Labour would choose James Corden, I mean, you know, stranger things have happened. You know, Hangus the monkey was the mayor of Hartlepool, if everyone remembers that one. But true. I think it's very unlikely that Smithy is going to be mayor of London. He might have a better chance if he's trying to become mayor of Billericay, I think, than mayor of London.
You could be right. So from talk show host to mayor, I'm going to give you a bit of trivia here. I'm going to put you right on the spot, Alan. Can you think of a famous example where somebody went from being a mayor to a talk show host?
Well, I mean, you could say that you know, Sadiq Khan has a call-in show on LBC. I don't know. I mean,
no need to swear.
Who are you particularly thinking of?
I'll tell you who did it. Jerry Springer. Jerry Springer did it back in the day. He was the mayor of Cincinnati, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was. Yeah, and then had a very
colourful,
strange career that he could have almost sort of by the end of it, he sort of slightly sort of recanted it all. By the end, he wasn't quite sure what he'd been doing with the Jerry Springer show. But yeah, that could be Sadiq Khan's next role, I suppose. If he does step down, maybe he could go and have his own talk show as well.
Indeed, we had Jerry Springer on the show a few years back, and it was, you know, when you meet someone and you sort of look at them and go, wow, it's somebody who looks really pronounced, almost as if it's someone wearing a mask of them. And he was a bit like that. He was so extraordinarily recognisable, and his features and everything about him just sort of stood out. And he's a really nice guy. And it was the day that Angus Deaton had just been, I think, fired from Have I Got News for You? Remember that back in the day. And of course, he said to me, he said, yeah, I'm doing Have I Got News for You tonight? He said, this Deaton guy, apparently, you know, he said, what happened there? And I said, oh, it was, you know, apparently all to do with, you know, I don't know, cocaine and hookers, according to the headlines, you know. And he said, wow. He said, so what was the downside? And I never forget him just brilliantly keeping this wonderful Springer-like thing. You seem to have disappeared. I can't see you anymore, Alan, but I'm sure you're still there somewhere. Listen, thank you very much indeed for your time. Great to have you with us. Alan Tolhurst, chief reporter at Politics Home, with us on the programme. We're going to take a short break. Back to you in a couple of moments. Lines are open. This is Talk.
I voted against my better judgment to reduce the winter fuel allowance because it was the start of a new government, and I thought they deserved some slack. Right. But they continue to be making decisions that I find difficult to justify. And as I said before, if we're going to spend money getting things that are just common sense with the EU, then it is going to lead to very difficult conversations between a lot of Labour MPs.
During the cold...
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Talk. Let's go back to your calls and comments. One here says, geez, how patronising that you think the general public only see him as his acting career. I don't know. Are you talking about James Corden? Or are you talking about Jerry Springer? Or are you talking about... Who was the other one? Arnold Schwarzenegger? So I can't really answer that because I don't know who you're referring to. But I would imagine if it was James Corden, which is where the story was, I think the term general public... yeah, I think most people would see James Corden through his acting career, right? I'm pretty sure that would be fair. This comes from Paul, who says, it may be difficult to undo this EU giveaway, but if you have the will, then it can be done. If you're a secret Remainer, I know you voted the Greens at one point. Also, I remember you being pro-migration. Oh, is that to me? Yes, I did vote for the Green Party once as a protest vote. And I won't go into the full details as to why and where, but there was a good reason for it, because I had the hump. But that's another story. Pro-migration, no, I don't really... Is there such a thing as being pro or anti-migration? I think most people are pro some form of immigration, aren't they? Ours would have no doctors working here. So I don't quite know, Paul, what you're referring to. I quite like the cryptic messages, though. Pro-mass immigration, no. Pro-channel immigration, no. Pro-mass giveaway visa immigration, no. So I thought that's quite clear. Phil's in Exeter. Phil, what have you got for us? Good afternoon.
Yeah, hi, Ian. I just wanted to say, Starmer's surrender deal puts us on the world stage, of course, but they're more as the EU's useful idiots. I just believe these elites are so out of touch with the electorate. Fisheries will be ruined in 12 years because of the size of the boats that they use and how destructive they can be. With these new food regulations, it's going to derail the US and other trade deals, I believe. Our young people now have more competition for jobs, university places.
Yeah.
And allowing young people to bring dependents in will increase immigration. I just do
What's
not
the
understand.
I can't get the dependent thing. I don't understand that. I thought the whole idea was that young people quite like the idea of going travelling, put it that way, right? And then you can go travelling and no one's going to say, you can't go travelling because we're not in the EU. Yeah. So take your rucksack, go and get a job at Costa or the French equivalent, although I'm sure Costa are out there as well. And that's how it's meant to work. You wouldn't take your family with you.
It's just unbelievable. I do believe, the middle-class lefty civil servants, Ramonas and judiciary now won't have to queue when they go to their second homes in all over Europe. So I think, that's a big plus for them.
Yeah.
The rest of us, we're just getting, again, we're just going to get killed. And I think that the electorate will now put reform into lots of positions.
What do you make of this problem that they would stumble across, though, Phil, that reform would have to kind of... they would have the indignity, although Paul just said you can, what's done could be undone, but broadly speaking, they would come into power with this deal in place for the next God knows how many years.
Of course, hopefully, in the details of this deal, there is a right to pull out by either side. So there should be something like that actually in this. And if they haven't got that in, then, it's absolutely unbelievable, isn't it?
Well, you'd think so. But I suppose there's a bit of a balance, isn't there? When you strike a deal, you want to strike a deal that's not easily undone. Otherwise, there's no point in striking a deal. But simultaneously, the reality is you might need to undo it at some point.
And I think from the fishery side of things, we can really, we can actually get fishery management vessels and actually start policing all the foreign boats in our waters and make it really difficult for them. And that's what they do to us. Yeah. So we can do the same to them if we have the will.
If we have the will. But, we also want, nobody disputes, we want a strong trading arrangement with the EU, right? But we just don't want one that is more advantageous to, the whole point is meant to be kind of mutually advantageous.
Yeah, I can't understand, with these new food and farming standards, how anyone signed up to that, because there is no way that we can actually compete. Our farmers won't be able to compete with the subsidies of the EU. Yeah. We have no redress in any of that, because obviously we haven't got politicians in the EU. Mm-hmm. With regard to the food standards, there are so many really long, convoluted restrictions on certain things, which just makes it untenable in some places to actually make a business.
Yeah, spot on. Listen, great call. Phil, thank you very much indeed for that. Nice call from Phil. This is John in Woking. What have you got for us, John?
I wonder what King Charles thinks about all this.
I don't know.
Well, it's his government, isn't it?
Well, I see what you mean, yeah. It's a fair point, yeah. What does King Charles
think?
It's
his government. And Brexit
maybe he loves it.
Law.
I don't know.
No. Brexit is law. And his First Minister is just basically written all over it.
So do you think he should step in? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I like to think he could.
Well, that's the thing. Can he?
I don't know. This is a question I've heard asked, but never answered. Can the king say no, stop it?
I don't think that. Not in my lifetime. I'm sure Henry VIII was a bit vocal on stuff, but I've never seen the Queen. I never remember the Queen stopping something happening. If that makes sense.
Well, not that we're told.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. Yeah, maybe there were things that were happening we didn't hear about. John, thank you very much indeed for that. That is John. More from you in a couple of moments. This one comes in from Glenn in Leeds, who says, so the EU gets access to our fishing waters for 12 years, regulation on our food. We're governed by the ECJ and have to accept rules. Freedom of movement for under 30s, so they can grant immigrants a passport, pop them on a Eurostar. No need for a boat crossing. Now they are EU citizens. What do we get? We get to go through passport control a little bit quicker. Yeah, well done. We are done. It's over, says Glenn in Leeds. I think you might be right on that. Jane says, I remember holidaying for many years in Brixham. That's in Devon, of course. When the Brexit vote was coming, the fishermen were flying Union Jacks and were delighted when we left. It's heartbreaking for them what has happened. Starmer hates indigenous people like me and doesn't care. He only cares about migrants. He's so cunning and untrustworthy. Although, of course, the boat deal, I think, has got Boris Johnson's name written all over it, hasn't it? The fishing deal, by the way. I think I'm right in saying that's when that bit was negotiated. Nobody could quite fathom that out. I don't know why specifically. I know overarchingly the argument goes that it's not it's a very small component of our finances, but it's not so small that it's not relevant, and it's massively important if you work in fishing. If that's what you do for a living, if you're a Scottish fisherman, English fisherman, whatever areas you fish from, Wales, Northern Ireland, wherever it happens to be, this is huge news. It's absolutely crucial to your trade. And of course, there's something symbolic about the fact that it's a, hundreds and hundreds of years old industry. We have done it successfully for a long, long time. The British government are arguing on this, that our ability to sell the fish back to the EU that we catch will be much easier and less curtailed by bureaucracy because of the deal they've struck. But it was always odd to me that fishing, of all things, was the thing that actually creates our border, if you like, was left quivering and unloved by Johnson and others who scribed out the deal in the first place. Of all the areas, you might think that would be a quite, if the visuals and the totemic nature of our fishing industry, if nothing else. But there it is, languishing, and it's languishing again as a result of what Starmer's done today and handed over a 12-year contract to the EU. And I find it extraordinary that that we cannot, and genuinely, I'm not saying this from a kind of a Brexity position, just as a politician, as a prime minister, if you were going to have to announce that you're giving away a 12-year contract to the EU for fishing rights, you would have to have a kind of a digestible equivalence to hold up and wave the paper and go, right, OK, if you think that's looking a bit iffy, let me tell you this. And Starmer could have turned around and had an outpouring of euphoria as he explained this magnanimous moment of what we'd got from the deal. We can't really. I mean, there's some regulations about vets, and the ability to export a sausage will become a little easier, and you won't necessarily have to queue up very long at the airport. Since Brexit, or since it was all carved out, I've been to several European countries. Spain, was in Bulgaria a couple of weeks ago, France, did I go to Germany? Anyway, I have no recollection of being made to queue in a way that impeded my journey in any shape or form. None whatsoever. It was all very straightforward on any of those journeys. So I don't know what we've got in terms of that. I'm sure there are days in high summer where you might find a quicker queue, but you know what that's like. You think you've gone for the quicker queue, and then you've got paperwork Pete in front of you, giving it large for about an hour with the customs person. 0344 499 1000. That is where we are. More of your calls and comments on the way. This is Talk. It's just gone 2:30.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Phil says, I didn't vote for a deal with the EU. Keir Starmer is an anti-democratic traitor. Well, I suppose, in one respect, we all voted for a party that would have done a deal with the EU at some point. You've got to do a deal with them. It's what the deal, ultimately looks like. And this, certainly on the face of it, doesn't look like the deal. I agree with Phil here. that you would hail as being a rather marvellous moment for British democracy or negotiating. So it does somewhat put Keir Starmer in the dock, nonetheless, for those reasons. Let's move to this story. Talking of Starmer, that phrase, feeling like a stranger. Nearly half of Britons apparently do feel like strangers in their own country. According to a new poll by More in Common, the cost of living, the pandemic, working from home, were given as reasons for a growing sense of isolation. Of course, last week it was Keir Starmer who warned Britain risks becoming an island of strangers if immigration isn't controlled, but the survey was carried out over a month before that speech. But nonetheless, people feeling like strangers. Bob Seeley is a former Conservative MP, regularly helps us out on a variety of issues. Afternoon to you, Bob.
Hi, good afternoon, Ian.
Nice to have you with us. What are your thoughts on this? Strangers in our own homes, in our own country.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think we've had greater atomization in our society for a few generations now. Mass immigration is not the be-all and end-all, but it's certainly part of it. And when you have people coming into communities in very large numbers who don't speak the language, then you effectively speed up a trend which is already taking place, which is greater atomization. I think it's really sad, actually, what's happening to our country for a variety of reasons. We need to be our politicians need to be working out ways of strengthening our society, strengthening communal relations, but also the institutions of civil society. And unfortunately, too often, especially people on the left, we've been weakening it.
Yeah, and there's quite a lot of elements, isn't there, to this as well? I mean, the pandemic, of course, was had a huge effect, and lots of us at the time, and I think you were quite vocal on this, Bob, the way that things were dealt with, the legacy of the pandemic, working from home, all of these elements that for half an hour some people thought were fantastic, but now may be paying a price.
I think, look, I voted for the first couple of lockdowns. I wish I hadn't. The first one was probably understandable. But it became very, very clear really quite quickly that it was going to come at a huge price that people hadn't worked out. And people being stuck at home for very long hours was one of them. Vanishingly few people under the age of 50 actually died of COVID. And I do think there's a very strong argument that we overreacted somewhat. We should have been protecting much more closely certain groups and effectively allowing other groups to, to get out there and lead their lives with some common sense caveats. We should have gone down the Swedish route, and Sweden, effectively, their model was the UK. We panicked because of some incredibly questionable and frankly incredibly unconvincing evidence which was put towards the country by Imperial College in London, and how anyone can ever trust those folks again, I'm not quite sure. But look, COVID aside, for sure we've got a more atomized society and we have less social cohesion. You even see it in more traditional parts of in the UK where you have less volunteering and less community action. It's a shame. I think mass migration feeds into that, but it's not solely about mass migration, but it's certainly a problem. It's certainly up there.
Yeah. Well, I don't know whether we've become is it strangers to each other, strangers to any social situation? I mean, we spent a long time locked up. We can, in that time, before then, in fact, but, it's never been as a bigger thing as it is now, and that's ordering food online. So you can order your food online, you can get your takeaway online, you don't have to visit a supermarket. I guess, we have isolated ourselves from each other in many respects, and working from home as well. If you do all of those things, you'll never see a soul.
Yeah, for sure. If you do that, then you can actually live your life in a very atomized way. And probably when you do start talking to people, it comes across as a bit of a shock. One of the reasons I love being down on the island where I live is because, you go to your local shop, everyone there. You're much more likely to be rooted in your community. People are much more likely to say hello and thank you and, just have the basic pleasantries of life. And sometimes in our big cities, we're losing that. And indeed, some other, many parts of the UK, sadly, we're losing that. So it's nice to try to keep that as much as we possibly can.
Yeah. I'm bound to ask you while you're with us, Bob, just a word on your thoughts on what happened this morning. Keir Starmer with the great EU trade deal. I was, really expecting him to come out waving a piece of paper with extraordinary list of savoury delights on there, but I can't find one at the moment other than it's going to be easier to export a sausage.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, look, we don't have, you said we have to do a deal. Actually, we don't have to do a deal, Ian. We've already got a free trade deal with the European Union. We didn't have to do another deal. And frankly, no deal is better than a bad deal. And I think this is a bad deal. For me, what really does it is that he has agreed to bind us, and he's effectively agreed EU punishment if a future government renegotiates this. I'm sorry, I'm not a fan of Keir Starmer, but after today, his loyalty is not to this country, it's to international courts and it's to the European Union. And let's just remember, this is a guy who refused to recognise the results of the referendum because he spent a year at least trying to overturn it and try to get a second referendum. This guy went into negotiations on the side of the opposite side in those negotiations. And I think what he's done today, overall, I think is pretty contemptible. I'm not saying there aren't decent bits of it. Look, going through e-gates 5 minutes quicker, fine. I mean, that's useful. But just on that point, Ian, as soon as, even back when Brexit was being negotiated, we said Europeans can come through e-gates. There's absolutely nothing to stop us going through e-gates in Europe, apart from the spite and resentment and bitterness of the European Union Commission class. They could have given that us at any time. And the fact that we have to sell out our fishermen in order to go on holiday and save 5 minutes at the e-gates, I find really, really depressing. The one thing this does actually show is that when you're nice to the EU, they take it and they throw it back in your face. If we had said no e-gates for European visitors to the UK, you can bet we probably wouldn't have been in this position. But absolutely, look, I mean, Starmer's bound us to effectively, economic punishment beating if future governments dare to rescind this dreadful deal.
Indeed. Listen, Bob, great to have you on as ever. The voice of common sense, Bob Seeley, former Conservative MP, speaking to us there on the programme. It's interesting. It's that EU negotiating tactic, which is kind of mafia-like. And I know you've got to be a bit protectionist over your own patch. I get that. I mean, look at Trump, for goodness sake. He's not going to move an inch unless he thinks it's advantageous to the United States. And we all kind of applaud him and all the rest of it for that. I think with the EU, what kind of marks it out is when it gets into territory where it really doesn't matter. I thought Bob's last point there was brilliant. That, the e-gate thing, just walking through a European EU queue, it would have taken nothing. We've got great arrangements with Ireland where we have a very easy way of going from one place to the other and working and, having a nice setup that's been there forever. But the EU, they could have just said, look, it doesn't really matter. The only reason we're going to impose this is out of sheer spite, because we can. And it's not a big faff, but it's just interesting to note that that is what they did. And then further down the line, they used that as a negotiating tool. Your ability to walk through a passport queue. Oh, get in the bin, Ursula. Really? You think that's that's a great... yeah, look what we gave back. They gave us 12 years of fishing rights in UK waters, and in return, we let them go to a shorter queue. Wow. That's where we're at. G says, if I ran a restaurant and a politician came in and ordered fish, I'd probably tell him it's off the menu. Yeah, darn right as well. Kevin in Southampton, Starmer has stuffed the fishermen and farmers, and the farmers. We're going back into Europe. This guy's undemocratic and a liar. And Sean says there is a reform clause in the agreement that says the EU will impose massive tariffs if future governments pull us out the deal. Bring it on, I say, says Sean in Bridlington. It is a bit weird, isn't it, the way all of this stuff works. As Bob just said, I think it was a message I got from Phil, who says I didn't vote for an EU deal. I said, well, you have to do a deal of some sort. And Bob says, well, you don't have to do a deal. No, you would you desirably do a deal, right? I mean, it would be desirable to have the best deals with absolutely everybody, including the EU, which is, I think, the biggest or one of the biggest trading blocs in the world. But it's not exactly running. It's not tickety-boo over there at EU HQ. It's a flipping mess. You've got half the place in recession. They're really struggling. They're not quite sure what they stand for anymore. You've got Ursula von der Leyen, I think I'm right in saying, still under some sort of vaccine investigation for, text messages with the boss of Pfizer and God knows what. I mean, it's a bit of a basket case. that's happening in the EU at the moment. So, yeah, of course you want some kind of deal. But this sort of idea that their starting point is they're the kingpins of international trade and commerce, and we're some new kid on the block that's just pitched up, you know, with a cap in our hand, which is probably exactly how Keir Starmer made it look. They started out, remember, yesterday with the proposal that they will have a 4-year, the UK government will give a 4-year fishing rights, 4 years. And somehow, during the ensuing hours of negotiations, which went on into the night, and they got pizza and pop around the table while they carried on, they came out with 12 years. How'd you go from 4 to 12? 4 to 5 I might get. I could even just about see why it might get to 6. But 4 to 12? 3 times what you were offering. Have we got something 3 times more delicious and advantageous back? I don't think so. Well, if we have, he's kept it pretty quiet. Paul is in Newport on this point. What do you think, Paul? Good afternoon.
Hello there, Ian. Good speech again.
You too. What are your thoughts?
I've done a few deals in my time, you know, not after daily type deals, but there's never a 12-year deal. Right? And don't let anyone tell you there's a 12-year deal. And you'll hear people talk of force majeure, spirit of you didn't comply with the spirit of the deal, so we're backing out. You know, now you have to have the will to do that, because what happens is all the lawyers get involved. Okay, yeah. But look across the pond. I mean, Donald Trump threw every blooming deal he'd ever. America, not him. America, well, including some he'd made. He cast them asunder and said it ain't counting, right? So I would encourage the sort of certainly the media, look at the exit clauses. With all of these deals, there are exit clauses. Any deal worth any sum of money, there's always a way out. There has to be a way out for both parties.
Yeah.
Now, sadly for us, and when we voted for Brexit, we saw just how petty the EU could be. You and I have spoken before about how it took 3 vets' signatures to export a cream donut.
Yes.
Remember?
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely right.
So,
should be
right,
4.
So anyone, when our negotiators gone in, they should have thought, right, we're dealing with petulant kids here. We're dealing with people that, you know, they're negotiators that know no boundaries. So you're not talking of like proper businessmen.
Yep.
They just come up with these flights of fancy and go for it. And our negotiators should have been prepared for that, and they should have been able to bring it into an adult conversation. That bit I worry about, and I do think this is just going to be another one of those things that we'll get into, a bit like the Chagos side. Well, we'll buy out for 19 billion then. What do you mean buy out for 19 billion? You own it, you know. Yeah. It's going to be another one of those things that, you know, Reform will get in or someone else will get in and say, right, we're out of this. This is not doing us any good. You haven't bought any sausages. I'm sorry, Ursula, you just haven't bought any sausages, so the deal's off. You've took, £1 billion worth of fish, and you haven't bought any sausages, so the deal's off, right? And you know then it's just going to go pear-shaped, isn't it? You can just smell it.
Sausage up.
Even 3 years down the line. Absolutely. You can smell the garlic in the sausage, and we don't have garlic sausages.
Indeed. It's a good point. And as somebody pointed out, you don't find many British sausages in a delicatessen in Rome either, so...
But my key point is, that for you guys in the media, not for me, because I don't do that, but you've got to check out the exit clause. The key is in the exit clauses. If we haven't got any, then whoever did the negotiating, right, sack them.
100%. Well, we're going to see what's going to happen in 2029 then. Paul, listen, thank you. I keep getting sent posts of Liz Truss, who's been saying that no parliament can bind its successor. That is literally true. You can't bind a successor. However, and I know this because we've been here countless times, well, if you're a new government, you just come in and overturn it, because that's the way democracy works. The British people vote for someone else, therefore that someone else is allowed to do that. Unfortunately, whilst Liz Truss might be correct in terms of parliamentary procedure to the letter of the law, the reality is a very different fish. Sorry to put that in there. When governments come in and they realise that, yeah, you can change that, but it might take you another 12 years to do it. There may be implications that go beyond just the desire to change it. There might be other factors that So you have to look at the paperwork, and that's why you find so many governments. You've seen it with Starmer. They've carried on stuff that the Tories were doing, and the Tories carried on stuff that Gordon Brown was doing, blah, blah, blah. So, yes, strictly speaking, you can't be bound by what the previous government does, but the reality is you pretty much are in a big, sizable chunk of areas. 0344 499 1000, 10 to 3, Voice of Doom on the way. This is Talk.
The great EU surrender by the UK is taking place as we speak, and at every level it sounds like a disaster.
Yeah.
My constituents of Boston and Skegness, my fishermen in Boston, will be absolutely spitting mad on the news that it appears that Starmer, in the face of a request from the EU to extend the deal for 4 years, he said, no, that's fine, have 12, why not?
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
It is Talk, just gone, in fact, coming up on 5 to 3. I'll talk to Sue in just a second. Voice of Doom, day 11, I think. Day 11 of the Voice of Doom. We know we are looking for a former Labour MP, all right? Who is this?
This is so interesting.
If you think you know, 87222, here it is again.
This is so interesting.
Who is that former Labour MP? Could have been a cabinet minister, could have been really famous, maybe not so famous, but yeah, they were there. Another clue coming tomorrow if it doesn't go, but hopefully it'll go today, and I can tell you after the news who it is. Don't phone in, just message in 87222. Here's the voice again.
This is so interesting.
This is so interesting, yet nobody knows who the heck it is. Sue in the Wirral, how you doing, Sue?
Not very well, really.
Go on.
I'm as mad as a wet hen, I really am. I spoke to you last year before the election. You were asking people to ring in and tell you if Keir Starmer was to be trusted.
Yeah.
And I said to you, I would not trust Keir Starmer as far as I could throw him. And haven't I been proved right? I am right. Well, I'll tell you right now, what he's done, he thinks he's been very clever, but what he's done is finished the Labour Party. He's absolutely finished it for me. I stopped voting Labour a while ago, but I tell you what, I was like that, whether to vote Labour again. But now I'm definitely voting for reform. If I could vote for reform, I would. But his Labour Party has cancelled the local elections where I live.
Yeah.
Right? So I've got no rights.
They are back next year, aren't they?
No, they're not next year. It's 2028. I'll tell you what he's done. Okay. Angela Rayner has redrawn the borders so that where I live is a Wirral, but the MP that is in there at the moment is represent Cheshire. So I'm lumped with Cheshire, and he's left with the fact that if something comes up, maybe a new factory or something is opened here, who's he going to do that for? Is he going to do it for Cheshire or where we live? No. The Labour Party did that. The Labour Party have taken my rights away. The Labour Party have overturned my vote of 2016. And the Labour Party did this. The Labour Party have destroyed democracy, as far as I'm concerned. And what I want Nigel Farage to do is petition the King. I want him to get a petition up, and I want Keir Starmer out, because the man is a fascist. As far as I'm concerned, he's as bad as Franco. When the Spanish people voted for democracy, he overturned their votes and he ruled for decades and decades. Now, did you hear that the man standing next to Keir Starmer say with underline? Did you hear him say? I heard him say the Gibraltar negotiations are going on.
I didn't. This was Antonio Costa, the president of the European Council, that was there.
Did you?
I didn't hear that. No,
I did. I heard him. Wow. I heard what he said because I was listening to every word, and he said the Gibraltar negotiations will go on. That's what they're doing next. This is what Keir Starmer, Keir Sly,
Do you think calling him a fascist is a bit over the top?
No, it's not. No, it's not a fascist, because a fascist is someone who doesn't accept other people's votes. A fascist is a man who can't be trusted. He's a fascist. Yeah. A fascist is a man who doesn't allow people to vote, because I'm not allowed to vote. And I'll tell you something else as well. Where I live, we've had years and years of a Labour council here. We have not got street lights. They switch the street lights off because they can't afford anything. We've got hundreds of asylum seekers here that our council tax is supporting. And the Labour Party, are they stupid to believe that we will vote for them over again? I tell you what, they're finished. They really are finished. And if they can't see it, then they're more stupid than I think they are. Because as far as I'm concerned, Nigel Farage is going to be the next Prime Minister. And Nigel Farage will just do what Trump does. He'll tear up any agreement that we've got with the EU, because the people weren't asked. I wasn't asked. I wasn't allowed to vote in May. Other people, thousands of people here, weren't allowed to vote, because the Labour Party know darn well that the people here in the Northwest are Brexiteers. That's why. The Labour Party know that, and they know quite well why I wasn't allowed to vote. They stopped me voting, and they overturned. He wanted to overturn our vote in 2016. The only people who've got no say are slaves. They don't have a say. And we're supposed to be a democracy, but we're not a democracy. We're slaves. And as my son said to me, Mum, if I wouldn't have voted if I'd known my vote was going to be overturned. And I said, no, neither did I. And what Starmer's done since he got in, when you asked last year, I told you the man is a liar. He's nothing else but a plain liar. And I want people to petition the King and ask the King to get this man out, because the man, as far as I'm concerned, he's a Stalinist and a fascist.
There it is. All right, Sue. Very strong stuff from Sue in the Wirral, but very passionate stuff. And that's how, if that's how voters are seeing a Western leader, then Starmer should realise he's in trouble, because I don't think Sue will be on her own on that one. What we did find from the reference that Sue made about Gibraltar, Antonio Costa, the head of the European Council that represents EU member states, said on Monday that the European Union and Britain were not very far from concluding a deal on Gibraltar. But they might be talking about sausages. I don't know. And I'm grateful to Keith, who says, did I hear you say Starmer's reset will make it easier to export hostages? It's a very good point. That's maybe what he really meant. 0344 499 1000. Sean says the elite and establishment think everyone hates Israel. Saturday night proved quite the opposite with the public. It's the same with this surrender summit, the sausage summit. Ramonas think everyone loves it. Voters will tell them otherwise, says Sean in Bridlington. Great point. Love that. And Paul says, it may be difficult to undo the EU giveaway, but if you have the will, then it can be done. A few people are making that point. I think that's exactly what we'll hear from Nigel Farage over the coming day or so. He'll say, if we get in, we will tear this up. Kemi Badenoch is also saying something similar. By the way, I think she's due to speak in the next hour. We got the voice of doom, day 11 of the mystery voice. Who is this?
This is so interesting.
Remember, don't phone in, but you can message if you think you know. 87222. Fingers crossed we get finally get a correct answer, and we can tell you who that is on the other side of the news at 3 o'clock. Coming to you next.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
It is Talk, 3 minutes after 3 o'clock. Welcome back to the home of Common Sense. Lots to talk about. We are naturally, why wouldn't we be discussing Prime Minister Keir Starmer? Now, he's insisting a reset deal with the... You love the language. A reset deal with the EU is going to make food cheaper, open up its market, and he claims it will add around about 9 billion quid to the UK economy by 2040. I'd quite like to see something like 9 billion quid by the end of the year, mate. Most importantly, he says it puts Britain back on the world stage. But what do we get for our bucks here? What do we get in exchange for giving away 12 years' worth of fishing rights? Apparently, the unimpeded journey of a sausage seems to be on the list. Have we been stuffed by Starmer? We'll take more of your calls on that shortly. 0344 499 1000. Also this afternoon, Gary Lineker confirms he's leaving the BBC and will present his final match of the day on Sunday, following a backlash over a social media post featuring a rat, an image, of course, clearly linked to anti-Semitic propaganda. He said in his video, we might play you the video again in a moment, but he said he's a campaigner against anti-Semitism, which is abhorrent, he said. Well, clearly not that abhorrent. He literally retweeted an anti-Semitic post on Twitter or on X. More of that on the way, and students are being taught that black people built Stonehenge, while major British victories like Waterloo and Trafalgar are barely covered as so-called decolonized and woke history lessons spread through our schools. I don't really care who built Stonehenge, to be honest. I just can't work out what the attraction of flipping Stonehenge is, for God's sake. We'll have more of that on the way. Everything you need to know, all the breaking news right here on Talk. 0344 499 1000. Let's just do the voice of doom.
This is so interesting.
Oh, that was quick. Wasn't expecting that. This is the voice that's been going for 11 days. Have we got a winner? Have another listen.
This is so interesting.
Who is that? These are some of the answers. I should have said, by the way, at the outset that it's not Matt Hancock, because everyone's been guessing Matt Hancock. Stephen Wolfe, no, it's not Robert Jenrick. Jeffrey Robinson, Ben Bradshaw, Nick Brown, Frank Field, Tony Blair, Tony Benn, Stephen Dorrell. He was a Tory, of course. Mr. Dorrell, now a Lib Dem, I think I'm right in saying. So yes, it's none of those, which means we haven't got a winner. It goes to day 12. You are looking for a former Labour MP, a former Labour cabinet minister who has appeared on this show not that long ago. OK, there's a batch of clues ready for tomorrow, all right? Former Labour cabinet minister who has appeared on this show relatively recently. I'd say 3 weeks ago, maybe, something like that. And he's been on more than once. Our lines are open. This is Talk 0344 499 1000. So let's move to the Lineker story. Gary Lineker has confirmed reports that he is leaving the BBC after this season's Match of the Day will no longer present its World Cup coverage. I like the word I'm leaving. It comes after he apologised unreservedly for sharing a social media post illustrated with a rat, of course, which has been used to represent Jewish people in anti-Semitic propaganda, including Nazi Germany. You might think he would have checked that bit first. And do you know what I keep saying? No one's really saying this. Even if you didn't know about the correlation between Nazism and the rat issue, you might still conclude, well, there's a rat on this. I don't really want to post that because clearly it's being used as an insult there somewhere. So if you didn't know the specifics, you would surely satisfy yourself that it's being used with nefarious and ill intent, you might think. Let's speak with Jonathan Sacerdoti, journalist and broadcaster, who's written on this very persuasively and powerfully, Jonathan, I have to say. So the man has finally gone after many years, of course, of posting tripe and offensive stuff. But it appears it was this, what did it, to coin the phrase. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Yes, Lineker is going apparently because of this rat image, but, you know, it's not really the first time. And I think this is really reflects terribly on the BBC that it's taken this long. He's got this history of platforming anti-Semitic tropes. He's got this history of disproportionate hostility towards Israel compared to anywhere else in the world. He's been silent throughout on Jewish suffering, especially since October the 7th. He's got this selective outrage that seems only to be reserved for anything the Jewish state does now, even when it's engaged in this very complex military engagement because of a brutal and horrific invasion by Palestinian terrorists on October the 7th, 2023. So despite all that, he's always reserved all his scorn for Israel. I think he's arguably crossed into territory that enables and excuses and amplifies anti-Semitic narratives all along. And the thing is, even if he didn't mean to, he's been told so many times by people, by the BBC themselves, by Jewish commentators, by journalists who I know have spoken to him even one-on-one. The fact is, he does know what he's doing. He's decided that he knows better than everyone else, or perhaps that it's worth it.
And with this particular, I mean, maybe, I don't know, Mr. Lineker, I've never thought of him as the sharpest knife in the drawer, frankly. I don't say that as a cheap swipe. I mean, genuinely, clearly a brilliant footballer in his day, and, you know, his punditry was, I assume, you know, successful enough for the BBC to keep him there for so many years. But nonetheless, when you look at the body of work and what's there, you might consider, if you were him, that last tweet with the rat image there, would he not have, before he kind of got involved, would he not have gone, hang on a second, I've been in trouble countless times. It's clearly and demonstrable to anyone with a brain that, you know, they're looking at what I'm going to post next. Maybe I'm best not to do so. Oh, and by the way, there's a rat. I don't know what the rat means, but it's clearly not very nice. So on that basis alone, I won't post it. But for some reason, he took the opposite view of that. And you have to wonder whether that was completely intentional. It wasn't a blasé moment of, oh, I forgot, etc. There's enough going on around him, Jonathan, for him to think about every single tweet that he sends, especially one about this.
I think personally that he must have been aware. He says he wasn't. That's what he says. But as you say, there have been so many things leading up to this that you would assume he'd be quite careful. And we know that he was consulted when the BBC actually rewrote their rules on what presenters like himself could share on social media. It seems then that he's even breaking the rules that he helped to influence. Again, it seems hard to say that you didn't know what the rules are if you were consulted when they were being made. And let's just think about that video, because it's not just the rat image, by the way. The video was called Zionism Explained in Less Than 2 Minutes, which I suppose maybe is his attention span for this complex issue. And it was created by the anti-Israel group called Palestine Lobby. It featured a person called Diana Boutou, who's a former PLO spokesperson. And that video described Zionism as privileging and giving exclusive rights to one group at the expense of another. It claimed that no Zionist could believe in equality. Now, these aren't nuanced or sophisticated discussions. They're kind of very virulent, passionate anti-Israel discussions from a particular place, which aren't really reflective of the truth. They don't get into the complex history of Zionism, the wide spectrum of political thought that's represented within Zionism throughout its history, even currently within Israel and the wider Jewish diaspora around the world. It's moronic stuff. It's being shared by someone who I'm afraid I can only describe as moronic, but it's worse than that, because I believe he knows what he's doing. I really do. I find it very hard to understand how somebody who was apparently knowledgeable about enough about the 1930s in Germany to say that Suella Braverman's language surrounding the then Tory government's policies on immigration was like Nazi Germany, but didn't know that a rat in this context would be seen as a Nazi image reflecting Jews. And he seems to have a lot, and frequently a lot, to say on Israel and Zionism. So it's very strange that these sort of 2-minute videos, these rabid sorts of videos with horrible messages like that are really his contribution to this discussion. If that's all he's got, he would do well to be quiet. I wrote it in my article. I don't commentate on football because I've got no skill or ability at that. I do know about this subject, and he ought to think about it the other way around. He doesn't know very much on this topic. He doesn't seem to show any willing to find out more in a reasonable way. He just wants to constantly condemn, and he's never condemned any other country as far as I can see on this. He tried to suggest that Israel should be banned from certain international football competitions. Did he do that with any other country? Did he call for such boycotts of Qatar, where he actually presented from? No, he didn't. This man, I think, is showing himself up every time he opens his mouth or he types on his keyboard about Israel, and it doesn't look good for him.
Yeah, spot on. And, of course, he's now put out a video saying, I'm deeply sorry. I've always stood up for the small guy, essentially, minorities in particular. Anti-Semitism is abhorrent, he says. But as you rightly say, Jonathan, his Twitter feed is curious by the absence of any other areas. I was, a couple of weeks ago just looking at some of the areas where, let's take the plight of Muslims, for example. Pakistan kicked out, as I'm sure you're aware, 1 million Muslims, back to Afghanistan, to a terrible plight. Uyghur Muslims in China. Never seen him write a darn thing about any of this stuff. The human rights abuses to, if you happen to be gay in Qatar, well, nobody's gay in Qatar because you can't openly be gay in Qatar, etc. Never seen him say anything on this stuff. It does seem very specifically Israel.
Yes, I mean, he supported the Qatar World Cup whilst criticising Israel now. He fronted the coverage of the FIFA World Cup there, a country that criminalises homosexuality, exploits migrant workers, funds Islamist extremism, refuses to recognise the Jewish state of Israel. All of these things, I've never heard Gary Lineker speak about those, never seen him do that online. He didn't criticise Qatar's anti-Semitism or human rights record during the coverage. He even mocked the idea of boycotting it. Obviously, he read out that pre-prepared script at the beginning. I think the guy's outrage is very selective, and I think the fact that he is constantly amplifying these radical, anti-Israel, anti-Jewish voices, never any pro-Israel ones. He's got nothing to say, as far as one can see, about the hostages who are still being held, about the hostages who've been released, the rise of anti-Semitism in the UK. It's all denial that what he's doing could even unintentionally be contributing towards that, never mind intentionally. And worse still, the BBC has tolerated this for so long. This is such a pathetic climb down for them. They've also shown that they've got no interest in sorting this out at all.
A powerful response, Jonathan, as we knew from you. Thank you for coming on with us. Really appreciate that. Jonathan Sacerdoti, journalist and broadcaster, with a really solid set of comments about the Lineker thing. And the more you think about it, and you get a good old brain like Jonathan there who can lay it out for all of us to see, you realise how horrendous this has been for the BBC, but also for Gary Lineker. Now, there is an argument that says, look, being an idiot is not a crime. I applied this to Lucy Connolly last week when it comes to what you tweet and what you don't tweet. I would say what he tweeted was up there, certainly, with, horrendous, as part of the overarching picture, or the the pie chart, if you want to look at it, of racism, which comes in many forms, and the Jewish people and those from Israel, etc., have suffered a fair bit of that, I think we can say, in their time. The fact that that tweet goes there, I would say immediately. I mean, let's be honest. He's been, I would guess, I've got to be careful what I say for legal reasons, but it would look to me, if somebody said, did he leave or was he fired? Well, what they probably did was come to an agreement. Could he have presented the World Cup next year if he'd wanted to? I would say probably not. So I think even by the BBC's sort of bizarre standards at dealing with this stuff, their extraordinary ineptitude historically on areas where they should have been straight out the traps very quickly, whether it was Hugh Edwards, and we're getting more information about how way back they were aware of some stuff. I appreciate you can't castigate or arrest someone because of a rumour, but I think when you're the BBC and when you're dealing with household names, you have to really give it both barrels when it comes to investigating. So the fact that the BBC stood by and not a lot happened in that time makes it clearly a very questionable relationship set up that's going on there. Were they scared to lose a big name? It might have been that. Could it well be, the fact that they just like Lineker? I mean, really, they couldn't find anyone else to do that. I think he's a, fairly slick presenter. I don't think anybody would dispute that. He knows his stuff. That's his territory. No one's going to slag him off for that bit. Unless you hate Leicester City or Spurs or whatever, but clean sheet Gary, never got booked in his entire career, not even an iffy yellow. Yeah, that's his thing. But this other stuff, now I don't know whether the anger around Gary Lineker is just about what he wrote, or whether it's about the fact that he works at the BBC and shouldn't write it. You can bolt one onto the other, you can look at them separately if you like. But yeah, I mean, he's got to go. I don't know whether he should be doing 31 months in jail like Lucy Connolly for an offensive, racist tweet. Perhaps somebody would differentiate between the two. Perhaps somebody would not differentiate between the two. Intention and malice. Oh, God knows. I don't know. You can have your own arguments about that one. But let's not pretend that it's not right up there. And if we conclude you can write whatever you want, even if it's really, we talked about this last week, didn't we? Even if it's really offensive, then fine, let it be there. But don't let, anyone think that the BBC should be employing you if you do. Michael's in Birmingham on this very point of Lineker. Michael, what have you got for us? Hi.
You stole my thunder a bit.
Sorry,
I think that's cool. I think his last tweet, the rat thing, is borderline hate crime. And, if some people are in prison for tweets, his liberty must be in jeopardy. But in general about Lineker, look, I don't think he's bright at all. I can see through him. But what he has done, he's hitched his wagon to a cause which he think would prolong his employment, which is like the liberalism, who probably run the TV stations. And that's what he's gone for. And that's what I think is so cynical. I reckon put him on a lie detector. He doesn't believe in half of it. In fact, I well remember him in the 80s when he's a professional footballer doing his shoot, likes, dislikes. His hero was Margaret Thatcher.
Wow.
and I let him come on and deny that because I've got that.
That's brilliant. That is brilliant. Yeah. So he kind of goes with the vibe of the time, and he obviously.
And he's not the only one with that. I mean, that's a typical Liberal trick. I mean, the Liberals are all very liberal when it comes to immigration, when it comes to whatever. As long as the immigration doesn't live next to them, by the way. But when it comes to the uncomfortable part of socialism, which is redistribution of wealth, they're all very protective of their property portfolio and stocks and shares and private schools.
Yes.
And he's right in that book. He's right in that.
100%. Michael, great call. Thank you for that. Really appreciate that. 0344 499 1000. And there is, I thought the last point he raised there was a really good one about the people that he's around or surround him will probably also endorse the kind of stuff that he says. So he probably, didn't leave it alone. It would be a sort of tacit comfort thinking, Gary Lineker probably thinks everybody thinks this. And that's the thing. And that's the problem with that area of life. And of course, I know that, a few people tweeted me saying, well, right-wingers, left-wingers, is there any real difference? And, I've said this before about social media presence. It doesn't take an awful lot to garner a big presence on. I mean, Lineker's exceptional because he was an international footballer, played for England, so he's sort of globally known. People of a certain era, I imagine. If you asked, an Italian kid today who Gary Lineker is, they might not know, but their dad probably would. But you can do this, and I look at the sort of people that I see, left-wing or right-wing, gaining really big followers because they stick to a theme. They don't necessarily tell the truth all the way, sometimes a little bit cheeky, sometimes because they couldn't be bothered to check it, often having to delete stuff, etc. And I think Lineker and those around him, and I think of that woman Perkis, who I think, interestingly, is married to a footballer. I'm sure she does, her own stuff as well. I don't think that's her only talent. And Supatansky is another one. He's got hundreds of thousands of followers. And you think, on what basis? Because you say stuff a bit Lineker-y. That's really it. And I think Lineker knew that. He knew there was this kind of lovey support for what he does and says. And probably when he got into work, you'd have people around him go, yeah, I saw that tweet. It was a great tweet, Gary. Yeah, absolutely. I'm 100% with you, mate. I bet nobody said, I'm sorry, I'm not going to work on Match of the Day anymore because I don't like the kind of rubbish you tweet, mate. I think you're off the mark. I don't think you know what you're talking about. I don't think it's an informed view. So there's that as well. I don't think he experienced really any of that. He convinced himself that the only people that had a pop at him were people like me in the Daily Mail. And everyone else was somehow on side. Another footballing pun that kind of writes itself. But I think that's his sort of belief. Should he have been fired for that? Probably, for that last tweet. I support freedom of speech, even if it's idiotic, and a lot of it is idiotic, but being an idiot it's not a criminal offence. I do wonder, as our last caller Michael said, whether the sort of hate crime thing sort of crawls into the last thing he tweeted. 0344 499 1000. A lot to get into on that one. Your thoughts on that? Lines are open. This is Talk.
During the Cold War, in the 1980s, we had something called the Home Service Force. And there were groups of them around the country, and their job was to defend key installations, communication centres, power nodes, radar stations, things like that. But it looks as if they're talking about reviving some version of that. So the old thing about there's nothing new under the sun, we actually had this, you know, in the Cold War 40 years ago, and it worked quite well.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Couple on Lineker. Sean in West Yorkshire says, why are Gary Lineker's tweets not considered a hate crime? Other people have been sent to prison for hateful texts and tweets, which is the analogy I made a second ago. I know that I'm not different. You know my views on this because we talked about it last week. The tweet things, not just Connolly but others, that happened during the so-called riots during that period, were treated differently at that time. I mean, you've only got to look on Twitter now, you'll find a shed load of hateful tweets all over the place, and no one's going to jail or speaking to a copper. But I would say in Gary Lineker's case, the desire to, I mean, you'd either have to say, I don't like what he put, but he's got the right to put it there, or he made a mistake. You'd have to apply the same to both. But he also had a position at the BBC, right? Which is why I think it clearly comes. I don't think even by the BBC standards they could have withstood the latest post, which he deleted. Of course he did. Ian, with Lineker going, will that mean our TV licence will be cheaper? Yeah, it should be about £3, really, shouldn't it, after Lineker's gone? Stop giving the Lineker publicity. Let him slink away into oblivion, says another one here. Michael is in Birmingham. Robert's in Hertfordshire. Robert, what have you got for us? Good afternoon.
Hi, Ian. Just before I come to my point, to do away with all this free speech, you should have 1 hour where anybody can say what they want about anybody. Just get it out your system.
I mean, it would be both hilarious and, it'd be entertaining. It'd be gripping. You wouldn't turn it off, would you?
Well, it'd be like I come from the school of there was an Englishman, an Irishman, and a Scotsman. You know what I mean? You could say that and tell jokes, and you used to laugh at each other. You know, it's been taken. Anyway, what I want to say to you is, I want you to put your clairvoyance hat on, the great Colin Zeno, all right, the clairvoyant, and I want you to put your hand on your heart and tell me where you think this country will be in 4 years' time under this government. It'll just be heading up to the next election, and I'll tell you what I think where it'll be in 2 years' time. I'll be very.
I can't see unless we're going to have like the most tremendous growth in the economy, which tends to do governments a whole chunk of favours. People tend to forget about, he did this with the farmers and the pensioners, but don't worry, because I've got a 28% pay rise and life's good. Unless that happens, then I think we are going to be on our knees, and the worst is yet to come.
Well, I'll tell you what I think, right? Within 2 years, we'll be at war with Russia, and he won't stop until he takes us on this stupid coalition of the not-so-willing, and some are more willing than others, and we're going to be bringing people. You wouldn't think it could get worse, but it can get a lot worse. I mean, you look at what Blair done. He'll take us into this, because Putin's not going to stop. He will not stop until the Soviet Union is back together again. Even he's mugged Trump right off. You know, and Trump, every time he comes out, he said, I'm going to walk away, I'm going to walk away. But he don't walk away because he can't. He can't stay out of the limelight. But there's trouble there. And, you know, Putin is not going to stop until until the Soviet Union's back together again, because he's got no conscience. He will sacrifice another 5 million lives.
So you're not hopeful that Trump's going to craft out some kind of deal that all parties are okay with? No,
it's, in this one, I've got a lot of admiration for him sometimes, but he's walking the walk, talking the talk, but he's not walking the walk, because Putin don't care. The only way you're going to get rid of Putin is going to be fans shot in a car park somewhere. And that is the only way.
Yeah, well, it's been said before that, he's either going out of that, the Kremlin, either in a box or an ambulance. It's going to be one of the two. He's certainly not going to be walking out of his own volition. Robert, I've got to wrap it up there, but thank you for that. Great call. Andy, back to Starmer. If there is a deal for Gibraltar, which most Gibraltar people want to remain British, does that mean that Spain will be handing back Ceuta to the Moroccans? I think the question about deal with Gibraltar was about trade, not about a deal for autonomy, I think, OK? Because otherwise I think we'd be looking at bigger headlines here today on that. I wasn't obviously there at the conference when those questions were being asked, but it looks every bit like it was a question in conjunction with trade as distinct from anything else, because of course Gibraltar being British territory over there, how will that affect this new deal with the EU? And Dave in South Gloucestershire says, I really hope Starmer never gets one of those scam emails from a Nigerian prince offering a huge amount of money if he hands over his account details. He seems vulnerable and gullible enough to sign up for anything. Give up on anything for his own benefit, says Dave. I do, yeah, I wonder whether he's had... Are they still around? There was a name for them, wasn't there? They're given a special name in the tech world. No, there's a name like NH67 or something, in that world. For the, anyway, there's variants of it from people who are going to, that they come into a lot of money and they want to give you a lot of money because you've been selected for some reason. So, but in order for them to give you the money, this is brilliant. You have to give them the money first, right? You have to give them the money first. Well, how does that work? You've got a lot of money. Yeah, I'm going to get the money. I can't unlock the money yet. You see, that's the problem. I can't unlock it until I can make a payment to customs or something bizarre like that. So I want you to help me. So can you send me 600 quid? And of course, this goes out to 20 million people around the world. And believe it or not, people do respond. Some people do it because they believe it. And when they get hooked in, and the reason those scams continue, if you've ever read the book Freakonomics, it will explain it. The reason those scams continue is because there's always somebody who hasn't heard of it, and there's always somebody who's vulnerable. And we knew somebody quite recently who got into a situation where they were handing over money and that they wouldn't be convinced that it was a con. They thought there was some kind of relationship going on. And these things work in different ways, and if they hit you or the right person at the right point of vulnerability, you start opening up the old bank account. Thank you for those. More from you on the way. 0344 499 1000. This is Talk.
across the UK. On DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
When it comes to offensive tweets and the like, is it ultimately, is it just based on, mostly our views only really based on whether you agree or like the person in terms of what they said, or sort of agreed with it? Is that ultimately it? You know, I saw, are these arguments about free speech, or are they arguments about free speech because you like the flavour of the free speech at that moment? So if you don't like Gary Lineker, then you want him fired. But if you like somebody who says something else, and I was reminded of this, I thought it was genuinely interesting if you can be bothered to intellectualise the debate about free speech, and it doesn't take much intellectualising. You know, it's a fairly straightforward set of rules on these things. Yes, you know, there's such a thing as libel, there's such a thing as defamation, and those things, you know, can land you up in court, or certainly, you know, whether it's a civil matter or whatever. So there's that. But if you're an idiot, you're just an idiot. But when I look at, you know, like the Lucy Connolly story, which it seems utterly extraordinary that this woman, albeit, I said last week, thick as mince and pretty vile in terms of what she, well, say pretty, I mean more than vile in terms of what she tweeted. But I happen to think that 31 months in jail is not the right sentence for somebody like her. Now, I saw a lot of people defending her. Were they defending her because of free speech, or were they defending her because of what she said? And that's the interesting bit. I also, you know, hopefully in a bid to try and be a bit consistent, last week I defended the bloke from Just Stop Oil. I think his name's Roger Hallam, who's doing a 5 years he's doing for hanging from a motorway gantry by his testicles, or whatever the heck it is they do over there at Just Stop Oil, or used to do. Now, that was horrendous stuff, and, you know, bringing the place to a standstill, I think it's a serious offence. Do I think it was the right prison sentence for that? Probably not. Although, you know, he had previously been warned. I don't know all the answers, but I'm just, you know, I want to put the right people, I want to put, you know, violent, horrible thugs in jail, rather than, you know, tweeters or protesters. I think that's broadly where I come from. But it's interesting, the Free Speech Union are really good on this. The Free Speech Union have defended people left-wing and right-wing on this very point, because it's about freedom of speech. But I wonder how many of those people, for example, the Gary Lineker fans who are saying he did nothing wrong, I bet you not many of those people would support Lucy Connolly in the free speech position, from the free speech position. They wouldn't extend it to that, because we don't like her thoughts. Lineker wrote an idiotic, horrendously offensive, racist tweet. And so did Lucy Connolly. They kind of did the same thing. We can argue forever about, you know, intent and which one was worse and which one came from the heart and which one was just a blurb. You know, I get all of that, but broadly speaking, that's where we're at. 0344 499 1000 points on that. Now, students are being taught that black people built Stonehenge and that the Roman Emperor Nero married a trans woman, while key British victories like Waterloo and Trafalgar are apparently largely ignored. A book used in schools called Brilliant Black British History claims Britain was a black country for 7,000 years, a claim critics call misleading and outside mainstream history. They argue that these decolonialised lessons influenced by Black Lives Matter are putting ideology ahead of facts. Let's speak with Zachary Marsh, Research Fellow in Education at the Policy Exchange. I mean, I guess, I don't know where to start with this, Zachary. I'm so confused. I feel as if I've had my entire history rewritten at the moment. But broadly speaking, I suppose we've all been different races throughout our time since we began has, you know, looked different, brown, black, white, whatever it happens to be. So I'm sure 7,000, you know, for 7,000 years there were people that didn't just look white. But the point of all of this is that there seems to be more than a little revisionism going on. Would that be fair?
Absolutely. And I think what our report showed was that in too many cases, we're having examples of students, you know, often at quite a young age. We look in particular at Key Stage 3 for a lot of our report, being exposed to narratives that lie far outside of the mainstream of historical opinion, but are not then getting the counterpoint of what perhaps we would consider to be a more accurate depiction of the past. So you cite some of the examples there around, for example, black people supposedly building Stonehenge, which is a very fringe perspective, which is not agreed with by the vast majority of historians, but is nonetheless being promoted in a very schools-friendly resource, which ranks among some of the top listed resources in this area. So there's definitely an issue of one-sided narratives being put across in schools, often by teachers who are very rapidly throwing lessons together because they don't have the time, they don't have access to high-quality resources, and therefore are kind of being tricked into using these outwardly very polished-looking resources that nonetheless put across a very politicised view of the past.
Where does this come from, and how does it make its way into sort of education? I mean, that's the, there's nothing wrong with a fringe view. It's a free world. People are, as long as they can corroborate their facts, in fact, even if they can't, I mean, let them be written off if they can't. But how does this stuff get legitimised, almost?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we've picked up on in this report that we've done with Policy Exchange is basically that large numbers, particularly since we sort of saw Black Lives Matter protests of 2020, of organisations have been producing school-friendly resources that essentially include their view of the past. And we, as I said before, a lot of teachers in this country are time poor. They don't have very long to put their lessons together. And these oven-ready resources are therefore very attractive for them to pick up and put into their lessons. The problem is that, as I say, they look very nice at the start, but often they convey these very one-sided perspectives. And one of the things we call for in our report is for teachers to not only have more training so that they can identify high-quality resources and they have the historical know-how to understand what they should be getting across, but also for schools to invest and be given the money to invest in better quality resources, things like textbooks that are likely to ensure that students get a proper version of history rather than activism in the guise of high-quality resources.
Yeah, and you can read, I mean, there's all sorts of books on all manner of themes where somebody has a different version of events to something, and that's fine. But if you're getting it into education and telling kids, one would assume that this is fact, then you're in a bit of iffy territory there, and guilty by omission as well if you are building a syllabus that deliberately omits, some fairly chunky and provable aspects of our history, but including stuff that's open to, to be generous, a bit of debate.
Absolutely, and one of the things that we want to see is students taught, in areas that are contested, for example, the legacy of the British Empire, students being exposed to both sides of the argument,
100%.
making sure that people are hearing both things, and often being asked to make up their own mind and begin that process of historical inquiry, which is a really important part of history teaching in schools. But as we found in the report, too often that isn't happening. We're getting one side of the story and not the other. And we are calling for a much more balanced view of history to be taught in schools, which is happening in a lot of places, but sadly not often enough across the board.
Indeed. Zachary, thank you for your time, sir. Appreciate that. Zachary Marsh, Research Fellow in Education. I think you should learn about a wide range of things in history. When it comes to black history, when I was at school, it was mostly a white school, but almost not exclusively, 99% I would say it was. We did learn, stuff like Martin Luther King. In fact, the book that we did this in RE, oddly, which was kind of had social sciences to it as well. And we had I Have a Dream was the name of the book for obvious reasons. I still have that book at home on my bookshelf, and I've given it to my little boy as well to look at. And I know he's now 11, so they've kind of got into a bit of that territory. And I only say that because to me, we were about 12 or 13, and knew about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and some of the history around civil rights and some elements of slavery. And so, yeah, we had some of that history. I didn't need someone to come along and make stuff up in order to make me understand one particular aspect of the human journey on planet Earth. There was a lot of factual stuff there that did the job for them. 0344 499 1000. One here from Mega Vegan says, Lucy Connolly's post included the phrase, "for all I care." That makes it an opinion, not a command. How can an opinion be described as incitement? I think her lawyers did her a grave disservice in telling her to plead guilty. Well, I think the latter point is true. She might not have gone to jail if she pleaded not guilty. I think that she pleaded guilty to incitement to racial hatred, of course, and that is, what she was charged with, blah, blah, blah. She said, for all I care at the end, I think set fire to the hotels with people in it. I don't think it was a command either. I don't think it was either. I think she just wrote it, and it was idiotic, and it was, clearly a horrible, distasteful, offensive thing to say, and she deleted it because I think even she clocked that it was. And the bit about the lawyer is interesting. I said that last week. I'm not quite sure how so many lawyers instructed so many people to plead guilty. Thinking, well, no one goes to jail for this stuff, but forgetting that, well, not when there's a alleged riot going on, then, yeah, you do go to jail. Clayton says, the Nigerian scammers were known as the 419ers. That was it. As that was the law. The Nigerian law they were breaking. Clayton, thank you very much indeed for that. Chris in Cumbria, we have been sold another pup by Starmer and the Labour Party. I think we need another election on whether people want this or not. I have boycotted all EU products now, as I don't want to support them, or Starmer, as this is a non-violent or abusive way without getting arrested. Well, there you go. There is a way to do it, isn't it? The only trouble is, you're then stuck with Chinese products, and they're a bit iffy as well when it comes to trade and human rights. But maybe beggars can't be choosers these days. Graham says, after never being booked, this is Gary Lineker, Graham in Bushy, after never being booked when he played football, it's about time he was finally given a long overdue red card by the BBC. Will he get any money for the remaining 1 year of his contract? It's a good point, actually. I wonder what clause was on the World Cup coverage. I would imagine, I think it would be unthinkable if Lineker demanded that he get paid, if there was money due. Maybe they were allowed to break the contract if ample notice was given. I don't know. But if there was money due, it would be incredible if he accepted it. Jason in Southampton, how and who do we complain to about Gary Lineker's posts? Surely it's offensive and racist. Why are there not 6 coppers knocking his door down? People have had their door literally knocked down for less than that tweet. Just let that settle for 1 second. 0344 499 1000. Our lines are open. This is Talk.
The great EU surrender by the UK is taking place as we speak, and at every level it sounds like a disaster.
Yeah.
My constituents of Boston and Skegness, my fishermen in Boston, will be absolutely spitting mad on the news that it appears that Starmer, in the face of a request from the EU to extend the deal for 4 years, he said, no, that's fine, have 12, why not?
your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Let's go to your calls. This is John in Bradford. How you doing, John?
No, not too bad.
Good. What are your thoughts?
Right, it's about Keir Starmer.
Yeah.
What a load of tosh. I just wanted to put my fingers down my throat and vomit. This man is the best recruiter for the Reform Party I've ever met. He couldn't tell the truth if his life depended on it. He sold Britain down the Swanee. He's destroyed any extension of the trade agreement with the USA. Mm-hmm. And, of course, he's got the Far Eastern group he's a member of. So if he can have to start imposing EU restrictions on food and things like that, where's the agreement's going to go?
Where does it all go? Where do you think... I mean, our last caller mentioned where are we going to be in 2 years' time, John? How do you see us moving forward? Because we've got a tiny bit of growth in the economy, but it's so small. We've got a shed load of other problems.
Yeah, that's until all the other things kick in. The increase in national insurance contributions and all that. That'll show in the next few figures. Let me put it this way: I just hope and I pray that this country can last another 3 years and another 4 years until it's out, because we're heading for a third world status. I mean, the area I live in used to be beautiful 12 years ago. It is absolutely disgusting now. There's rubbish all over the place, and it's just unbelievable. The change here in 12 years has been unbelievable. Imagine what it'll be like in another 4. Wow. I think this man is a traitor, and I'll tell you something else. I think there should be a national petition to get this man out, because he's selling this country down the Swanee.
Strong stuff. Listen, great to have you on, John. Really appreciate your call. That's John in Bradford. I want to get it. We've got Peter Cardwell coming in shortly. John, Harry is in Sheffield. What have you got for us, Harry? Afternoon.
Yeah, well, I've just heard your last contributor. I think Starmer basically has lit the fuse. This country is heading towards civil unrest. Yeah. He is absolutely ignored public opinion. He's doing what he wants to do. He basically reminds me of Merkel in Germany and Tony Blair. He says he's tough on this and tough on that. He's going to do this, and he's just opened the borders again.
What about the lefties, though, that think that he is like Nigel Farage with his comments on immigration and visas and the like? The left, who hate him, well, the right as well, when it comes to getting rid of some disability benefits. So he's in this curious place where many people on the left think it's a national scandal. They don't even recognise him as their own. I'm talking about his own MPs here, and people on the right naturally hate him. And there is an argument in politics that if you're upsetting both groups, you've done something right. I can't see what it is, by the way.
No, I don't think anybody else can, basically. It's just, I don't know what's happened to this country over the last few years. I spoke to the chap who answered the phone earlier on, and I was just sat and I was absolutely fuming. I'm looking round and thinking, what the hell is going on?
Yeah.
We voted for Brexit, and he's just basically ignored 12 years fishing rights. What right has he got to do with that? He's only in government for 4 years. What is going on with this country?
Yeah.
He's acting like a bloody dictator. Angela Rayner and the other one, Reeves. I look at them, Prime Minister's question time, and basically they're in space. They're just nodding. Honestly, he has lit the fuse paper. This country will kick off big time, and something will start it. And I don't know what it will be. You've got the fishermen, the farmers, the disabled people getting benefits taken off them. It's just, your last caller said he doesn't recognise. I don't recognise this country anymore. I fear for my grandkids. I am so angry with this man. And he said get a petition to get him out. You can't get a petition up to get a Prime Minister out. Basically, what I believe will happen, it will be civil unrest on the streets. It'll kick off with a nice warm summer. That's what they're frightened of. Then it'll kick off.
Do you know what I wonder, though, John? Someone like yourself, someone like me, people who listen to this show and engage and care about what's going on, are we a tiny minority? Are we just a small group of people? Yeah, people read some headlines and they might clock a bit of the news at 10. But actually, all the stuff we discuss that you're interested in, the stuff that puts fire in your belly and gets you out of bed in the morning, I wonder how that translates across the wider population. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean. I know loads of people.
Yeah.
Who feel the same as me.
Yeah.
And they're frightened to say it. They really are frightened to say what is really going on in their lives. They sit behind the front doors and I have never watched mainstream media for at least 3 or 4 years now.
Wow.
And I scan YouTube and God knows what else. And I make sure everything I watch is fact-checked.
Yeah.
Right? And I mean, I do. I go over and over. I'm looking out my window now, right? And there's people sat behind their front doors thinking exactly the same way as me.
Yep.
Right? Angry, frustrated, annoyed that their lives aren't going the way they're supposed to be, which is normal.
True.
But there's so much frustration out there. And
there is.
It's only going to take one little spark. Yeah. I am 70-year-old, right?
Yeah.
But to be honest, if the police want to listen to this or whatever, I am perfectly willing to go stand in Sheffield city centre.
Not naked.
Not at all.
Don't do that, H.
With people who have the same ilk, who are so frustrated about what's going on in this city.
I get it. I get
it. We've had enough.
All right, listen, on that point, Harry, I have to step in because the news is about to come on. Very passionate stuff. A plea almost from Harry in Sheffield. Thank you to him. This one just Mick from Walsall, who says, why would you allow young people to bring dependents to Britain if they are only taking bar work or studying? We all know these people will never return to their own country, especially if they are immigrants who've been given EU citizenship. It's interesting. Peter Cardwell is here. It is a bit confusing when they started to talk about dependents. It's like, what backpacker brings a dependent with
Well,
them?
exactly, and the whole point of a youth mobility scheme is that you have no, you're young, free to do whatever you want to do and come and do a bit of bar work and maybe live in a house with a few other people who are there and go and do that. I benefited from one of these schemes when I went over to America for a year, but it was incredibly clear that we could have worked for another year. I stayed there for another 6 months, but after that 2-year period, you've got to go. You cannot come back. Even if you meet someone, you marry, you settle down, whatever, none of that. You've got to be out of America, and I think we need to have those kind of safeguards too. But certainly when it comes to dependents, if you're a young person here to do a seasonal job or bar work or something, you don't need dependents.
When you put your rucksack on your back, you don't go, right, you ready, Nan? And then off you go. You know, where you go, we're going to Kuala Lumpur first, and then we're going to go and see the burning peat bogs of Borneo. Might struggle with Nan's wheelchair on the high bits, but no one does that.
It's true. It's absolutely true.
That's not the point of a young person's mobility.
And it actually points to a wider question, I think, in all of this, which is I can see lots of good things for the EU in this. I can see the EU, Chesney Hawkes lookalike Ursula von der Leyen, she'll be going home saying, all marvellous, everything perfect, all wonderful,